Hey, welcome to Capturing Christianity. I am Cameron Bertuzzi, and today I'm joined by the Joshes, two Joshes, Josh Rasmussen and Joshua Sijuwade. Should I call you Joshua or Josh? I don't think I even asked you that last time. Do you go by Josh or Joshua?
Are you talking to this Josh? Or
Which Josh am I talking to? Yeah, the Sijuwade.
Joshua. I'm happy with anyone.
Either one. Okay, I'll just refer to you as Josh.
Friends call you Josh, and your closer friends call you Joshua, or some of my friends call me Joshy if they know me, like, they're my wife or some very close friends.
I think if someone's annoyed with me, maybe my wife, she might say Joshua, and my mum, but normally, it's just Joshua. Trouble.
Okay,
that's funny.
Cameron,
okay,
let's call him Joshua. If he starts making mistakes, he's like in trouble.
Yes, that's the way.
Good. All right, we'll do that. So let me just give some context for the audience if you're watching this. And the title of this video, the topic for us, is a new exciting argument for the existence of God. I've already done this with Joshua, with Sijuwade, Dr. Sijuwade. We've already talked about his argument, but I thought as we were going through his argument, which I've actually linked 2 papers from him in the description of this video. One of them is Fundamentality in the Existence of God, and the other one is Grounding in the Existence of God. We discussed the second paper, Grounding in the Existence of God. We'll discuss more of that in this show as well. But as we were going through that episode, I was just thinking it would be so helpful to have Josh Rasmussen here with us to help break down some of these concepts, and then maybe also make some connections between his work and Sijuwade's work. And it's just like there's a whole lot of overlap, I think, between the two of these guys. This is going to be an amazing conversation. I can't wait to dig in. I've also got some slides here, some like illustrations and stuff. Like last time I drew something out, and so Joshua in his papers, he's actually got like good illustrations and stuff already in there. So I've got some of those I can put up on the screen. Joshua, just let me know when I should put those up. But how should we get into the topic? Give us we'll situate us. Give us a kind of overview. I mean, we were talking before we went live. You need to have like a sort of elevator pitch that you can give people on your argument. And I don't know if you're there yet, but just give me the elevator pitch as best you can, and then we'll get into some good dialogue on it.
Yeah, so my argument focuses on trying to put forward God, or the claim called theism, the claim that there is a God, and it's trying to put forward this claim and saying it's the best explanation according to certain criteria for the existence of non-fundamental entities, so entities that are dependent. And it's also the best explanation according to that criteria for the grounding relation, so this important relation that connects all of these entities within the layered structure of reality. And so, I'm trying to say, given what we have when we have this claim of theism, we have the best explanation on the table, better than any other explanation that can be put forward according to this criteria.
Whoops, I pulled up the wrong screen. Josh, Rasmussen. This is
maybe too short now. I'm too long and now I'm way too short.
Joshy. Okay, I'll call you Rasmussen and Sijuwade. I think that's going to be the easiest way for me. Okay, so Rasmussen. I'm just going to let you guys go back and forth, but Rasmussen, please help us like understand, because you've read the paper and stuff, and you said with your wife, who's also just extremely intelligent about this paper and stuff. Just give how about this? Give us a summary in your terms, in your words, of what the argument is, and then we'll ask Sijuwade if it's accurate, if it's an accurate summary of it, and then maybe at that point we can go into some back and forth.
Okay, yeah. So I liked how you put it in terms of just trying to give the best explanation in terms of a criteria that many leading philosophers already accept, and it's kind of putting the pieces that many philosophers already accept, putting it together and showing how those pieces actually point to God in a way that maybe those people who see and accept that criteria, they weren't seeing that before. And then we'll break down how exactly those pieces point to God as the best explanation of grounding or explanation. I'm very neutral with respect to whether this argument succeeds or not. So I'm actually curious how the conversation will go. My thought is we'll break it down and then we'll see if it's utterly destroyed by the end of this breakdown, or if breaking it down actually helps to illuminate the argument. maybe shows its brilliance even more. Maybe shows how it can connect even to additional philosophical positions beyond perhaps what you've been thinking. So that would be kind of my simple summary, and then sort of how I'm thinking of the argument.
Yeah. So yeah, that's perfect. Sorry, Cameron, I don't know if you want me to jump in.
No. Go ahead.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's very helpful the way you sort of put it. And yeah, the argument itself is really based on trying to further or extend the work of Richard Swinburne. So very famous, very influential philosopher of religion. And he's worked a lot on natural theology and specifically things like confirmation theory and trying to say, what are the criteria that historians and scientists use in their explanations when they're weighing hypotheses. And so what I tried to do is saying, I really think Swinburne is onto something with this criteria. It just seems to be, even if, there's not, even if it wasn't wide acceptability, it just seems intuitively correct that, when we are looking for the virtues of a hypothesis, the virtues of an explanation, we try and see if that explanation leads us to expect the data that we find. So the predictive power. And does it fit with our background knowledge? Does this explanation fit with the things that we accept in the wider fields of knowledge within philosophy and outside? And does it, is it simple? Is it postulating an entity or many entities? And is this entity complex in a way that has loads of properties and things like that? And I was thinking that Swinburne is really onto something here. And I felt that this criteria, this way of doing natural theology, arguing for God's existence, can be utilized within sort of I wouldn't say new context, because people have always been utilizing arguments for metaphysics, but Swinburne himself was more focused on the traditional sort of science, I will call the physical evidence or the scientific evidence, that we start from the cosmos and the features of the universe and saying God is the best explanation for those features. And I was trying to say, well, we can resituate this sort of explanatory framework within a metaphysical context. So a contemporary metaphysical context that utilizes notions like fundamentality, like grounding and other things related to that. And I said, actually, when we do that, it seems to be the case that God, defined in a certain way, so the way I sort of define God, which we'll probably get into later, it seems to be the case that God fulfills those criteria for the phenomena that's found within the field of metaphysics. So what I was saying to you, these non-fundamental entities and the grounding relation, it seems like God is the best explanation according to this intuitive criteria. And so, yeah, that was sort of my approach and
yeah. So Josh, it sounds like there's maybe three parts to your argument. Part one is identifying some data that has to do with grounding. Part two is describing this criteria for what it is to be the best explanation of that data or of any data. And then part three is showing why God meets that criteria. So why God is the best explanation of that data. And I wonder if it would be productive, and Cameron, you can guide us on this, to go through those three parts. So we could maybe begin with you talking about this data of grounding. What is grounding? How are philosophers thinking about that? Then we could talk about this criteria for the best explanation, and we could analyze that. You've already mentioned some of the pieces of that criteria. We could slow that down. And then we could talk about like why you're thinking God fits that the best of the other models. Yeah. What do you guys think?
That sounds great to me. I also wanted to mention, because I think this can sort of start the conversation. The two papers that I mentioned that are linked in the description of this video, one is on fundamentality and the other is on grounding. And Sijuwade, when you and I talked the first time on the phone, you were explaining to me, when you started talking about fundamentality, that's when I made the connection to Rasmussen, because he's got an argument, and he and I have talked a whole bunch. He's got arguments that like any non-fundamental thing's got to have an explanation, and that gets you to a fundamental thing. And he kind of does the same thing that you do, where he then he wants to analyze what are the features, what are the properties, and according to you, you got God as a trope, and so he doesn't have any properties. But the point is that he's still he's got these explanatory criteria, if you want to call it that he's applying to these different theories of this grand theory of the metaphysical foundation of reality. And so I just think that there's a whole lot of overlap there, but maybe we could talk about these two features. So fundamentality and then grounding, because those are related, but they're distinct, right? So I think it'd be helpful to sort of point out some of the similarities between your work and Dr. Rasmussen's work, let's talk about fundamentality as that phenomena, and then let's look at grounding afterward, and then see what the similarities are.
Perfect. Yes. Yeah. So it's the argument and the data that you were speaking about is sort of focused on this sort of idea that's caught on quite a lot in contemporary metaphysics, with a lot of philosophers sort of buying into it. This idea that reality is structured into layers. So we have these layers of reality. Reality is not just one layer, one flat sort of layer where everything exists in the same way. It seems to be the case that reality is structured in certain layers. Sorry, Cameron, just before I move on, I don't know if it's possible to get that image. The image where, the economics one, where it has, exactly that one. That will be very helpful. So, so this is sort of the layered structure of reality. Reality is structured into certain layers. And so we have reality starting from the bottom. And so you can look at it in sort of two perspectives. You can look at it at a sort of general categorical level, which is on the left, or you can look at it at a more specific level, looking at actually the phenomena, which is on the right. And so they correspond to each other. With the one on the left, you have the category of physics being at the lowest structure, the lowest level of the layered structure of reality. And then above that, you have chemistry. And then above that, you have biology. And then above that, you have psychology. And above that, you have economics. And then getting a little bit more specific, the phenomena within those categories on the right, you have, for example, quarks, which are sort of at the base level of reality. And then you have, let's say we're looking at a human person. You can look at anything, but looking at a human person, you have the chemical structure of a human, which is at a higher level of reality than the quarks that make up that human. And then you have a human brain. And then above that, you might have a human mind. And then above that, you have things like goods and services. So if I was working as an economist or I was a lawyer or something, I would be coming up with many theories. Those sort of things are at a higher level than all the things below it. And so reality is, like I was saying, not just at one level, there are many levels. Now, the important thing when we see reality within those levels are specifically the things that fulfill or fill up the certain levels, and the thing that connects those things that fill up the certain levels. So the way that philosophers, metaphysicians at the moment, the way they see this structure is that as you move higher up the structure, the layered structure of reality, you are moving up to things that are less fundamental. So the most fundamental thing, for example, if we're taking this picture, would be quarks. They're the most fundamental things. Everything else that exists is made up of those quarks. And then above that, you have something which is less fundamental, which is the chemical structures of things. And then above that, looking at a human, you have something that's even less fundamental than the chemical structure, which is, for example, the brain or the organs or anything that you can pick in the human body. And then above that, something even less fundamental, you have the human mind. And then you have all of these theories. Now, these things are structured in that way of fundamentality. The thing being at the bottom is the most fundamental thing, and the thing at the top is the least fundamental thing in the layered structure of reality. Now, what I'm trying to look at are two phenomena within that specific structure. What we're looking at are the non-fundamental entities. So, for example, just going for this picture that we have, the non-fundamental entities in this specific structure is the chemical structure, the human brain, the human mind, and the goods and services. These are non-fundamental. And there is one thing or many things within the lowest level, the quarks, which are the absolute fundamental entities. And so what we have are non-fundamental entities, all of those four things, and then the thing at the bottom is the absolute fundamental entity. Now, why these things are non-fundamental and the quarks are the fundamental things in this layered structure is because there is a relation of grounding that connects each of these entities within this structure. The quarks ground our chemical structure. Our chemical structure grounds our human brain. The human brain grounds, for argument's sake, let's say we're going with something like physicalism or something like that, it grounds the human mind. And then the human mind grounds all of the theories that we think about. And so what you have here is a structure of dependence. Each of the things, as you are ascending up the levels, you have a relation of grounding that is connecting each of the entities. And so just now sort of summarizing the phenomena that we're looking at that I believe needs an explanation are the non-fundamental entities within these structures. So the chemical structure, the human brain, the human mind, the goods and services, and also the relation that connects each of these entities, the grounding relation. Each of these things need to, I argue in this paper, need to be explained by something more fundamental. Now, someone might say, well, we've already got that with the quarks. Now, what I try and do in the argument is try and say, actually, given these, the physical options on the table, I believe we need to go even deeper than the quarks, than the physical level. We need to go to the theological level and postulate the existence of God, who accounts for all of the non-fundamental entities in that structure. And he also accounts for the grounding relation that connects each of these entities.
Joshy, do you want to interrupt here at all? Do you want to make any comments?
Well, just to sort of frame what you're pointing to here, Josh, is the data. And there's two pieces of this data. One is the connection, the grounding connection, which is kind of like a building relation or an explaining relation. So the idea is that we can sort of understand human psychology in terms of maybe sort of more fundamental layers of the world. And then those layers can be understood in terms of even more fundamental layers. So there's this grounding relation. So that's part of the data that you want to explain. You actually want to explain the explaining relation. You want to, in some sense, explain the very relation that highlights explanation links between everything else. So that's one part. And then the other, and I was thinking about this, wow, this sounds amazing. You want to explain like all the explainable things, all of them. And it's like, that seems like a lot to explain.
Yeah.
But what you're actually pointing to is not that you're trying to provide an explanation of all the particular things. Like your theory is going to explain the economy and biology and quarks. And it's not that, it's that there is this totality of dependent or grounded things. There's a totality of them. And then you want to explain that totality. Like what explains the total of the dependent things, that dependent stack? What explains that? So tell me if this is right. So the two pieces of data that are on the table are the grounding relation and then the total of dependent things. Is that right?
Yes, that's exactly, yeah, that's exactly it. And just to sort of just further emphasize something, exactly as you were saying, and it was very helpful that you brought that out, is that I'm not going for, I'm not trying to explain each of the particular data as you were saying, because exactly, I'm not going to be, in an economics class saying, no, but God is the right theory. What I'm trying to do is sort of similar to what Swinburne was saying, is that there are different types of explanation that you can have. So, sorry, Cameron, I don't know if it's possible just to go back to that image. It might just be helpful for people to see it, just to understand. Yeah, so let's just go with the goods and services in the human mind. The goods and services are fully explained. Their existence is fully explained by the human mind. I don't need to postulate, no one will postulate God to say, no, God is the best explanation for this theory being true and this theory being true in economics. No, each of these things are explained. The human mind is also fully explained by the human brain. Let's say we just take that for argument's sake. And then the human brain, its existence is explained by the chemical structure and so on and so forth. Now, these things have a full explanation in virtue of the things that they are directly grounded by. But what I'm trying to say is that actually that whole structure itself needs a more deeper explanation. The same way that the quarks are I use the term in the paper, the fundamental explanation for each of the things above them. I'm trying to say that actually we need to go deeper. We need to say there is something even further down in a way that is the more fundamental explanation for all of those things existing in the here and now. But it's not them having their particular way of existing. No, they're existing in virtue of their grounds. But the ultimate ground, the thing that ultimately grounds all of those things in the here and now, that if we were to get rid of, per impossibile, we were able to get rid of God, all of those things will not exist because they lose their ultimate, more fundamental grounds.
Yeah, another comment, if I can bring this in, which is very, very interesting to me, is the way philosophers think about what's more fundamental is that more fundamental things are underneath the less fundamental things. This is how we draw our pictures. So, like in the philosophy of mind, sometimes we'll talk about top down causation. And the idea is that there's this sort of being that emerges and that has this power to affect downward things that were otherwise thought to be more fundamental, the very things that sort of produced the brain and then the mind. And this is exactly the opposite of how people in spiritual traditions often think of God. So if you think about how people would worship, they put their hands up, they look up. I say think of God as up there, okay?
Yeah.
But philosophers think of the more fundamental things as down there. Now I know this is just a spatial metaphor, but I think that spatial metaphors frame our thinking in ways that can lead to this weird disconnect in communication. So I just want to highlight this because when philosophers are thinking about God as the most fundamental thing, they might point downward. God is down there. But if philosophers hear people talking about God as up there, it already creates this weird feeling like on a psychological level, like, well, things are up there those are less fundamental. Why would you posit something out there in the sky when we already can explain everything out, in this direction? And what you're pointing to, Josh, is that, well, we're not positing God up there in the sky. What we're doing is we're just tracing the explanations down, and then we're just arriving at the sort of ultimate explanation. And then we're seeking an analysis of what kind of thing would be ultimate. And if it turns out that thing, its nature fills out as a supreme nature, then that's just the result of explaining things. That's not something that we're sort of arguing for, positing up there. So I just wanted to point this out because I feel like I made this sort of psychological discovery that the way that I think people talk in maybe the popular sphere about God is the spatial metaphor is exactly the opposite of how philosophers are thinking of the most fundamental reality. And so this is a reason why even in my own work, I would sometimes use the term foundation when I talk about God, is because I'm appealing to this audience of philosophers who are thinking of the more fundamental things as sort of deeper down, right? And so I'm sort of articulating my arguments in that language. And Josh, I see that that's what you're seeking to do as well. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. No, I completely. Yeah, I think that's very helpful the way you've put that. That's great.
So where should we go from here? I mean, do you think we should start to look at the different explanatory virtues?
I think that would be the next thing. I think it might be worth just taking one more little bit of time to highlight why you think there is this grounding relation at all. Now, you gave some examples to illustrate the grounding relation, but I mean, are there other ways of accounting for those examples? Is there a way of sort of flattening our view where there is no grounding? And how would that play into your argument? And then I think that will help us to get very clear on the data, why we think it's there, why philosophers think it's there. And then we can, I think, look at what would be the criteria for explaining that.
Yeah, perfect.
Does that sound good?
Yeah, so, that's great.
Yeah, so why believe that grounding is real? Yeah.
I can go with that. Okay, so I sort of assume Schaffer's arguments for this. So the main sort of, because just for the audience to understand, grounding isn't sort of a univocal sort of notion that everyone just says, yeah, we all understand the nature of it. Majority of philosophers who affirm the existence of a grounding relation, they would maybe have different conceptions of its nature, just because it's a primitive relation, and so we can't define it in any sort of further clear terms. But what you can say about it are sort of its features and the way that it's analogous to certain other relations that we assume to be true. And so I utilize Jonathan Schaffer's view of grounding. And there are certain features. Well, grounding, number one, as I was saying, is the relation that connects fundamental entities to non-fundamental entities in the layered structure of reality. So it fulfills that role. But also, something very important about this relation is that it's analogous, according to Schaffer, it's analogous to causation. And actually, I think in the article itself, I take the stronger view that's been put forward by a philosopher called Alistair Wilson, who works at Birmingham, if I'm correct. And he had a very good paper where he was arguing for even a stronger view that it doesn't seem to be the case that grounding is just analogous to causation. It seems to be a relation that is actually a type of causation. And so we can call grounding a metaphysical causation relation. And so causation is a category of at least two relations or two types of relations: metaphysical causation, which is grounding, and nomological causation, which is a relation that is diachronic. So our normal view of causation, which is a diachronic relation,
Cross
that's
time.
now, yeah, that's nomological causation. But grounding is a synchronic relation. It accounts for something existing at that specific point in time, but we can still say it's a type of causation. Now, this is really key in sort of arguing for its existence, because Schaffer and Wilson say, and I sort of go with this view, that the same way that in our everyday sort of understanding of causation, we postulate the existence of a relation because it fulfills that sort of causal role. We need a relation in order for causation to be accounted for within the scientific realm and within wider fields. And so given that grounding is a type of causation, and we postulate the causal relation because it fulfills its explanatory role, it seems to be the case that we can do the same thing for grounding. And so grounding, given that it's a type of causation or it's analogous to causation, the same way that we treat causation, we can also treat grounding as well. And because we affirm, a lot of philosophers, and obviously you have some skeptics, but a lot of philosophers will affirm in some form there is a relation of causation that's at work in reality, we can also affirm there to be this relation of grounding, or this metaphysical causation relation. And Schaffer even goes further to call it, not just him, but other philosophers as well, that grounding is actually a law of metaphysics. And so the same way that we say that there are laws of nature within the physical realm, in the metaphysical realm, we need there to be laws of metaphysics, grounding relations that can fulfill the explanatory roles that they need to do. And so given that grounding, it just seems to be the case that it's evident in reality. It seems to be the case that, as I was saying in those examples, let's say my brain is grounded by something more fundamental, which is my chemical structure. My chemical structure is grounded in something else. And so it seems to be the case, because we have these sort of paradigm cases in reality, we need to postulate it because of the explanatory worth that we can get from postulating that relation. And the same way that we do for causation. And so it's this sort of relationship to causation that allows us to affirm the reality of grounding. And Schaffer will go further, and he argues in his paper, one of his papers, that it's causation and it's explanatory role that it fulfills that we need to affirm its existence. And I think that's what some philosophers would sort of go with as well, sort of the role that it fulfills in the same way that it does for causation. And so, I sort of go with that and say I think there's good reason to affirm its existence.
So, Josh, do you have any pushback on that?
Well, so one way of, I don't immediately have a pushback, except that I had three thoughts I wanted to share. Now I'm organizing them. One of them is that, and maybe this could be translated into a pushback, is, but also a way to maybe help the case, which is that I think you don't need to have a worked out theory of grounding. You can sort of leave it open and think of grounding as a very minimal relation, such that it could even be a type of causation. But it doesn't have to be. So you just leave it open. And I think then that helps your case, because you're not filling in more than you need for your case. So I was going to say, one of the arguments I hear you pointing to, Josh, is that there is causation. Grounding is a type of causation. Therefore, there is grounding. So that would be like an argument. Why I think there's causation? Well, then you appeal to our experiences in the world. There was another kind of argument you pointed to where you're positing this grounding relation to explain other things. Maybe it fulfills a sort of theoretical role in our theory of the world. And so there are certain attributes that it has. It functions sort of like a causal relation or an explaining relation. And you have paradigm examples. And I think, and so this isn't really a pushback at all. Actually, I think the best kind of argument for the reality of grounding is pointing to the examples. In fact, this is my third thought, is I actually think you can witness grounding directly in your own conscious experience. And I'll give an example. So that you don't actually have to posit grounding merely as a theoretical entity to explain other things. You can do that. But that you can also witness grounding directly. So here's my example. So I'm paying attention to my heart. And I notice a feeling. I feel content. All right. So I feel content. Now I have this other thing in my mind, which is the thought that I feel content. And then I notice that that thought is true. And then I notice that there's a relationship between the feeling of contentment that I noticed and the truth of the thought that I feel content. And it seems like there's a kind of truth-making relation, or you can use any words you want, but just I have to actually, I'm closing my eyes because I'm doing the work of like focusing. To get this information, you have to do the work, pay attention, see if this works for you. So I'm focusing in on my thought, I'm focusing in on my heart, and I'm noticing the thought is true. And I'm noticing, oh, the feeling of my heart seems to make my thought true. And that making relation is an example of what you're talking about, Josh, when you're talking about a grounding relation, this kind of explaining relation. It's because I'm feeling this way that my thought that I'm feeling this way is true. And I'm directly, immediately acquainted with this making relation. And I believe this is actually the clearest way to see that this relation is real. It's just by your own direct, immediate acquaintance with its reality.
Yeah. That's really
so that's not a pushback. I mean, that really is adding. So I'm with you on this. I find it convincing, and it is a mainstream view among philosophers.
I just can't. I can't imagine Sijuwade going through that exercise with somebody, like another philosopher. Like, focus on your heart, dude. Like, focus on your heart a little bit, and let's think about ground.
This is what we do at academic conferences. Okay, guys, everybody, I invite you to now focus on your heart. Well, I mean, like David Hume, he famously argues that there's not a direct acquaintance with causation, and so then there's philosophers like Michael Tooley who make a case for positing causation, explain other things. But I mean, I just disagree with Hume on this. I mean, I think that you are acquainted even with causation within you. You're acquainted with this relation, or at least that you can be. So I should be more modest. Yeah. You can fail to see things that you can also see by another angle.
So here's a question, and I think this will get us a little bit further here. So I'm pulling this illustration back up, and you made the comment earlier, Sijuwade, that the quarks, you argue that there's something that's going to ground, or there's going to be a more fundamental level than quarks. So there's going to be, and that fundamental level, in your view, is God. How do we get there? Is that when we start to look at the different explanatory virtues, and then we look at the different options, and then theism is the best option? Is that the way that you arrive at that conclusion, or is there some other reason that you've got that there's a deeper grounding? There's a deeper.
That's the exact reason. So it's sort of saying that this criteria, if something fulfills the criteria better than the phenomena that's we've taken to exist, but that we're postulating something that better fulfills the criteria than the phenomena itself, then we should descend lower in that level. And we should say, actually, maybe there is something simpler, or there's something that explains the data better, or fits with our background knowledge better. And so that means our explanatory stopping point shouldn't be at the quarks level. It should be somewhere else, because we can. Because
and you could. I was just thinking, you could do that. I mean, scientifically, you could do that like at any point that you wanted to. You could just say, okay, well, we're just going to stop here. We're just going to stop at the existence of planets. We don't need to go deeper into what they're made of or how they got here. Like, that's our explanatory ultimate, is just like planets. They just exist. Yeah. So you could just like have your explanatory ultimate be anywhere you like, so to speak. So you've got to have some kind of like, I guess what I'm getting at is you've got to have some principled reason for your stopping point. And that to me is like basically the divide between theist and atheist, is like, where do you draw the line? What's the most appropriate place to draw the line? So I mean, maybe at this point it'd be good to get into the explanatory criteria.
Yeah,
that's great. Yeah. So this criteria
And I don't
is
have a
what.
slide for that, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, that one. Yeah, so I think it's a bit more clear than the other one. Yeah, so this criteria is the criteria that I assume from Swinburne. So I find in Swinburne's work, and then I try and further develop it by utilizing certain things from Jonathan Schaffer again. So Swinburne was arguing in his influential work, The Existence of God, and other articles and books, that there are at least 4 criteria or criterion, sorry, that we use to when we're trying to put forward the best explanation for a certain phenomena. And so when we're trying to justify an explanation, we need to see if this explanation fulfills this criteria. And so there are at least 4 tenets of this criteria, but 3 of them are really important. One of them sort of drops out. And so just running through these, each of these. So we have the first one, which is the criterion of predictive power. And so if a hypothesis or an explanation is to be true, it should lead us to expect the data that we have or that we're trying to assess or analyze. It should lead us to expect it. It shouldn't just lead us to expect things that we don't find in reality. And this seems to be a very clear thing, not just in metaphysics, but in science. When we're putting forward an explanation, does it have predictive power and worth? Does it explain what we have actually found? And I would say that that just seems to be a clear criterion that anyone would assume for an explanation. It should lead us to expect the data that we have, and it should explain it to a very good level. But the key thing, even though it says predictive power, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to find the data in the future. It can just be that basically, does it explain the data well? If it does, then it fulfills that criterion. And then the second one is the criterion of background knowledge. And so that is that our explanation should fit with things within the wider fields of knowledge that we assume to be true. So there might be other areas, it could be in philosophy generally, it could be epistemology or ethics or other areas of metaphysics itself, or it could be in the wider fields of science. Does our explanation, the entity that we are postulating to explain our data, does it fit with these things or not? Do we assume the existence of the type of entity in other fields? And it's a very key thing here that I want to bring up. And if anyone does read the paper, it's sort of buried in a footnote. But it's important, I believe, for this criterion that we are looking at, and it could be maybe a little bit of a difficult one. Maybe, Josh, you can come back and explain this if I don't explain this very well. But there's, I think, a distinction to be made here between types and tokens. And so I believe that the background knowledge criterion is to do with the type level of something, of an entity, and not the token. So what I mean by that is
that distinction. Oh, you're going to illustrate it? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
I was going to say, just like if you have 3 letters on the screen, you have A, B. And they say, well, how many letters are there? Are there 3 or are there 2? Well, there's 2 types. There's type 1 is A and type 2 is B. But there's 3 tokens because A has 2 instances of the same type. So tokens are instances of a type. Yeah.
That's really helpful. Yeah, that's great example. Yeah. So what I'm saying is that the entity could be an entity, a token, a specific instance of a type that we might have never encountered before. But as long as the type is something which we accept in wider fields, so as we'll go on to later, so the type trope, for example, is accepted in wider fields, then I believe it fulfills the criterion of background knowledge, even if the particular instance of that type might be something which is new or we haven't seen in other fields. And so, yeah, just this criterion is just saying it should fit with our wider fields of knowledge. It shouldn't just be something that we just bring up, that doesn't fit in other areas that are accepted. Okay, then you have the criterion of scope, which is basically saying that what is the explanatory range of this explanation? Does the entity seek to explain everything, or does it seek to explain something a little bit more narrow? Now, generally, the more narrow the scope of an explanation, the more likely it is to be true, because it's less likely for it to be falsified. If something's trying to explain everything, it's not probably going to do that very well. But if it's explaining something very specific, then it's going to be something that's more than likely going to be true than the wider explanation. Mm-hmm. However, I do, and I sort of go with Swinburne on this, I do believe that this criterion is not helpful in this type of context. Now, Swinburne sort of believed that in a scientific context, when you're trying to go for ultimate explanations of reality, like trying to explain the universe and everything that exists within it, it seems to be the case that you are seeking to explain everything. And so this criterion is not going to be very helpful when you're weighing ultimate explanations. Now, in the metaphysical realm, I believe this is the case as well. When we're trying to go for the fundamental thing that explains everything else, ultimately within that layered structure of reality, and we're trying to assess different fundamental explanations, the scope is going to be extremely wide. And so that means then, if we had that criterion, it's not going to be very helpful. You won't be able to have any explanation that's going to be taken to be true. And so, yeah, I believe that criterion sort of drops out. So it's not very important, the criterion of scope. And then the last criterion is a criterion of simplicity. Now, Swinburne, I think he's very famous for this. But something I want to sort of highlight is I think he makes a very good distinction, which is widely held in the field of philosophy, maybe people like David Lewis, where there's a distinction between quantitative simplicity and qualitative simplicity. Now, I know Swinburne doesn't use those specific terms, but in the wider fields, people normally sort of see simplicity in that way. So an explanation is quantitatively simple if you're postulating the fewest number of entities or the fewest number of properties. And so it's about the number. And something is qualitatively simple if it's postulating the fewest qualities of that entity, the fewest properties that entity has, or the fewest kinds that it falls into. And so something is quantitatively and qualitatively simple if it's postulating the fewest number of entities and the fewest properties of that entities and the fewest kinds that entity falls into. And so simplicity is trying to go for the most parsimonious sort of ontology that we're trying to put forward. Now, this is where I sort of make a further extension with Schaffer's work, because Jonathan Schaffer has argued for something similar to this. So normally in the wider field, we use the term Occam's razor, which is very sort of famous, postulate the fewest entities as necessary. But Schaffer believes that actually that's not a very helpful way to put it. And so he puts forward something called the laser. So it's sort of an upgrade on the razor, let's say the 21st century upgrade. And it's saying that you should postulate the fewest fundamental entities. So it doesn't matter how many entities that you postulate within that layered structure of reality, but we should postulate the fewest number of fundamental entities. Now, sort of putting that within Swinburne's framework, which I seek to do in the paper, I then say, sort of restating that we, in a qualitative and quantitative sense of simplicity, we should postulate the fewest number of fundamental entities and the fewest number of fundamental properties or fundamental kinds that those entities fall within. So it's about fundamentality when we are looking for simplicity, and that's the key thing. And so just putting this sort of in a slogan way, this criteria, an explanation, I believe, is a fundamental explanation for entities within the layered structure of reality if it's the simplest explanation that fits with our background knowledge, that leads us to expect the data when otherwise that data would not be expected. And so any sort of explanation that does that, I believe, is the correct, is the explanatory stopping point, the place that we should stop in that layered structure of reality.
So you would say it's the best explanation if it comes within the constraints of that criteria.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's
I like how you put that. I had just a few questions and comments, if I may, on this. I thought might help to use an example to sort of think about this. I'll say give two examples. One from sort of ordinary life where things are wet outside and you think, what explains that? And one hypothesis would be that, well, it rained last night. That seems to fit with background knowledge. So it seems to fit that criteria. It seems to be you said predictively powerful. Another way of putting it is predictively successful. It does seem to successfully, criteria one, it successfully predicts what you see, that it's wet. Yeah. It would seem to be relatively simple, and that would make it a better explanation than an explanation that says, no, it's not that it rained last night. Here's what happened. Some birds dribbled some water over here. There was a sprinkler that went off over here. Some boy came out and spilled some water over here, and some alien ships came down and put water in the rest of the places. Well, the problem with that, one of the problems with that competing explanation is that it's more complicated. It's got more parts, more ways to be false. So that makes it less good than the rain hypothesis. And then on scope, well, in this case, we're explaining maybe all the different things that are getting wet. And so that's like many different things that are getting wet. There's not many different kinds of things because it's just wetness, but wetness in different places. Now, I thought it was interesting, Josh, that you said that maybe scope wouldn't apply to fundamental theories because the fundamental theories explain everything. And so since all fundamental theories equally explain everything, they're all sort of equal with respect to scope. At least that's one way of interpreting your thoughts. So they all sort of wash out. But I was thinking that maybe there's a difference here, a relevant difference between an explanation where you can see the link, you can see the explanation. In other words, like you can see that if there is a supreme being, then there would be resources for intending or fine-tuning your universe. You could see that. But you can't really see that if there were a flying spaghetti monster, that just by analyzing the concept of a flying spaghetti monster, that it would have the resources to finely tune a universe for life forms. Even if, as a matter of fact, a flying spaghetti monster could be a grounding or an explanation of life forms. It's just you don't see that connection. It's not illuminated by the theory itself. And so I was thinking that, well, if we think of scope in terms of illuminated explanations that you can see, you can tease out from the core hypothesis, the things that are explained, then explanatory scope could be enormously helpful because you could have a theory that explains, you can see how it explains many different structures of reality, the fine-tuning, the moral structure of reality, or at least that there is some moral dimension to reality, that there is a kind of intelligibility to reality, that there's reasoning that exists, that there's consciousness, that there's the ability to reflect or be aware. And these are like maybe different aspects of reality. And there may be some grand scale theories about the foundations where you can tease out that, oh yeah, if that theory is true, we would expect morality, intelligibility, consciousness, etc. Whereas we wouldn't expect that from another theory that maybe as a matter of fact would explain everything, but you wouldn't see the explanation links there. And I wonder if that might be a helpful way to bring scope into your criteria.
Yeah, I think so. I think, because maybe the phenomena that I was looking at was at sort of that general level, just the non-fundamental entities. But I think when you get more specific, actually that could come in play and be more helpful, I think, in sort of like saying, actually, there seems to be this virtue here when something, explaining this in this sort of way with a certain scope, in this sort of way with that certain scope. So I think, I do agree with you. I think that would be very helpful. And just something I want to qualify as well. So for those who sort of have read or watched sort of Swinburne and his sort of explanation of this criteria, something he does when he applies it sort of in this ultimate fundamental sort of way of trying to explain reality, he will normally say he believes that background knowledge falls out as well. So he doesn't just say that scope falls out and background knowledge falls out, but he does say that. And so he would then just say that the two core criteria that we need to hold to is simplicity and predictive power. So the simplest explanation that leads us to, expect the data when otherwise it wouldn't be expected, that's the best explanation. Now, something I want to sort of be quite clear is that I don't follow him in that sort of way. I think background knowledge is needed. And I think some people who have pushed back on him on this issue, saying actually it seems to be the case that background knowledge should place a certain role, maybe not the biggest role that some people have assumed it to be, that, oh my gosh, if that entity doesn't fit, to this exact way with all of the fields of knowledge, then it shouldn't be accepted. I think that's too strong. And maybe a lot of people wouldn't argue in that way. But generally, I think background knowledge should be in play there. I'm happy to take all of the criteria and maybe even the way that you said of explanatory scope and say that actually God still fits with that. And I think as we go later on to explain the definition of God that I sort of go with, there isn't a reason to say background knowledge isn't going to be helpful when it comes to God, because I think it actually is very helpful. But it's just a distinction I want in play that background knowledge does also play a part in the way that I put forward the argument.
That's good. Yeah, I like how you put that. And then as far as scope goes, maybe the way I was defining scope, that is taken into account in predictive power. So predictive power includes not just success, but sort of the range of things it's successfully predicting. And so that sounds good. The other thought I wanted to add here is that this isn't just Swinburne's criteria. I mean, this is kind of a widely recognized set of theoretical virtues, which are, you might say, great making features of an explanation. So if the explanation is simpler, that's going to make that explanation better than if it's more complex, other things being equal, etc. And another final kind of thought on this, and then we can see how God sort of fits into this equation, if at all. We can explore that. Is that the reason for simplicity here, and in particular, Schaffer's laser, that we're razoring off unnecessary fundamental complexity. The way that I think about this is that we can understand why simplicity at this level is an advantage in terms of just our ordinary understanding of probability. That if you have otherwise unknown pieces, so piece A, piece B, piece C, and these are pieces of a theory, and you don't have sort of insight into whether those pieces are true or not, then the more pieces you add to your theory, the more opportunities for that total theory to be false, because the total theory will be false if any one of them is false. And so that's where kind of the way that I think about it is, if I bracket my background knowledge and I don't have any, or even if I include my background knowledge, I just don't have any insight into those pieces, then other things being equal, it's better to have the theory that has the fewer pieces, because then that has the less risk of being false.
Again,
so it's not just that Swinburne and Schaffer, these famous people believe this. It's that they believe it for reasons. They believe, and these reasons, there are controversies about how to analyze simplicity and what exactly is the best way of accounting for why simplicity is a great making feature. But there's a wide consensus that, other things being equal, the simpler hypothesis is going to be more probable.
Thanks. That's a great way of putting it. Thank you.
I did want to ask you, Sijuwade, how did your audition go?
Audition? Well,
you auditioned for James Bond, right?
Oh man, maybe, or James Bond villain. I think that's probably our ability.
It was a lame joke. Okay, I did want to ask you, because we mentioned this in the last show, but it didn't get brought up yet. But you talked last time about laws of metaphysics as opposed to laws of nature, or maybe in addition to laws of nature. And when you just said the term, it like some light bulbs went off in my mind of like, that's why I think it makes sense to ask why is this grounding relation even there in the first place? Same kind of question that gets asked about the laws of nature, like why are there any laws of nature? Why do atoms stick together? Stuff like that. It's like, why do these things even exist? Why is that a real thing? And so when you put it in that terms, like you've got these laws of metaphysics and they basically rule over the grounding relations and other stuff in metaphysics. That was just really helpful to me to see that maybe, we do need to have some kind of account for why these laws of grounding exist, or the laws of metaphysics. Anyways, I thought it'd be helpful to bring that up. I should have brought it up earlier, but the thought just occurred to me. Do you have anything to add on to that?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think it's still I would say in its infant stage, maybe that terminology, laws of metaphysics, but you are sort of seeing it more in some prominent metaphysicians, where they're actually saying it seems to be the case that we need some laws to fulfill the explanatory role that we believe is needed, and we, exactly as you were saying, Josh, before about these paradigm examples. All, like most grounding theorists, they will start their papers with paradigm examples, things that we can latch on quite easily to and say, well, that just seems to be evident in our reality. But then they would say, well, if you are committed to those paradigm examples and you understand them correctly, it seems to be that we need these laws of metaphysics. And so there is sort of that sway in sort of terminology. So I think it's a more terminological thing, because a lot of people anyway now are sort of moving towards grounding sort of theoretic frameworks. And so I think that terminology itself is probably going to catch on a little bit more as hopefully the conversation proceeds forward.
Yeah. And I mean, you could also just think of it as rules of reality, where some
Yeah.
rules of reality are about physical particles. And so you call those physical rules. Some rules of reality are about value. Maybe there's rules of justice, right? Some rules of reality are about grounding. And since philosophers who call themselves metaphysicians are thinking about those things, grounding, we could call those metaphysical rules. But I mean, they're basically just rules of reality, and they're just different parts of reality to think about. I think sometimes what happens is people who specialize in one part of reality, let's say maybe physical particles or quarks or whatever, that part sort of looms large in their mind, and so they're sort of thinking of everything maybe in terms of that part. So then you get this idea that, well, there's only physical rules, only rules that describe sort of physical parts. But if you just think of rules of reality more generally, then you can sort of open up the playground to be thinking about rules of math, rules of reason, rules of logic, rules of right and wrong, psychological rules, and then you're kind of building your largest view of the world, taking into account all the possible rules there could be, including then rules of grounding. And that's where you're sort of uncovering this sort of new argument for an interesting conclusion by thinking about, okay, how can the currently accepted or widely accepted views in the mainstream philosophy about the rules of grounding actually be used to build an argument for this conclusion about God. So yeah, I like that, the way that you put that.
Awesome.
I'm actually really happy that we've got an hour to discuss why God is the best explanation of the phenomena. So let's turn to that now.
Fall apart.
Yeah. Might completely just burn and crash. Yeah, but it's also the really the probably the most interesting part as well. So how should we go? Well, Sijuwade, just take us away, and I'll have all the illustrations and stuff on standby as well. So just let me know when you'd like those to be shown.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So the way I proceed forward with this argument is saying, okay, now we have the phenomena in front of us. That is, we have two sort of things that need to be accounted for. We have these non-fundamental entities that exist within this structure of reality. And we also have this relation that connects each of them, this grounding relation. So we have these two phenomena. I'm saying, well, given this criteria, and let's say we assume this criteria to be the one that's going to help us assess the fundamental explanation, which explanation do we have that we can put on the table that best explains the existence of these things, non-fundamental entities and the grounding relation? Now, focusing first on the grounding relation, because I think it's more helpful then, and then moving to the non-fundamental entities. There are we can say that there are four sort of options on the table. You can go with, firstly, a primitive option, which is basically saying that the grounding relation is fundamental itself. So it doesn't require any further explanation, because if something's fundamental, it does not need an explanation for its existence. It just exists in an ungrounded fashion. And so some philosophers, for example, Schaffer, one of his options that he's argued for is that the grounding relation is fundamental itself. So it doesn't require any further explanation. So I called that in the paper the primitive option. It's sort of a brute fact that the grounding relation exists and it doesn't require any further explanation for its existence. And so that's one option that someone can take. And then another option that someone could take, let's say we call these the physical options. You can take another, and so this is focusing again on Schaffer's work, because he's the person who's really sort of argued for these positions in the most extent. So he would say that there are sort of two physical options that we can go with. We can go with something called priority monism, and we can go with something called priority pluralism. Now, these seem like technical terms, but when you sort of understand it a little bit more, we break it down, it doesn't seem to be something that is that complex. And so you have priority monism and you have priority pluralism. So those are the two other options on the table. And then the option that I put forward is theism. I'm trying to say theism, the claim that there is a God, is the best explanation for the grounding relation, and it's obtaining at any point in time in the layered structure of reality. And so that's sort of the options on the table for the grounding relation. And we have the same options on the table for the existence of the non-fundamental entities, except for the primitive option. And why it's the case is because these entities are already defined and assumed to be non-fundamental. So you can't then go and say, well, their existence, they're fundamental entities. No, they're not. They're non-fundamental. And so they require an explanation. And so for the non-fundamental entities, you just lose the primitive option, and then you can still focus on priority monism and priority pluralism and theism to best account for each of them. And so those are sort of the options on the table that I believe are plausible options. Obviously, there can be more. There'll be things that fall in between these options. There'll be other ways of defining it as we go through it. But just sort of looking at sort of contemporary metaphysicians, I do believe people who have sort of put forward these grand hypotheses, they sort of fall either into the priority pluralism view, or they fall into the priority monism view, or maybe the primitive option, if you sort of take that line of argument.
So
Yeah, so that's
options.
what we think on the table, and then we can break it down here.
Yeah, so your strategy is to say, we've got 3 options. These are kind of the main competing options. And 2 of them are problematic. That leaves theism. That's where we're going, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's sort of in that way. I'm saying for me, because as I said before, if something best fulfills that criteria, then we should say that that's the explanatory stopping point. So a very important thing that I bring up later in both of those papers is that my view is not that you have to reject priority monism and pluralism. Mm-hmm. So and as we go through it, you can take a priority monist view, you can take a priority pluralist view, but what I'm trying to argue for is that you cannot take the entities postulated by those explanations to be fundamental. So you might take the perspective of monism or pluralism, but then you also need to go further and postulate theism. So it's not saying you have to get rid of them. It's just saying...
Should we pull up the illustration for that one? Because when I looked at the illustration, it was really helpful.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Yeah, we can... let's go with monism and pluralism first, and then we'll go...
So not that one.
Yeah, not that one.
Not that one, this one.
Yeah, that one there. Okay, so... Yeah, what we have in front of us is these 2 competing explanations, and they're mutually exclusive, so you can't hold to both. So you have to choose one. Now, they're both put forward by Schaffer, but with pluralism, I sort of find this in the work of Peter Simmons as well. So I think he would be someone that will affirm that view. So I say they're sort of the philosophers that we're assessing. So priority monism and pluralism, it's the idea, it's really based on 2 ideas. The idea about how is reality mereologically structured, and how is it structured when it comes to fundamentality. So mereology, so it's mereological structure. That's to do with parts and wholes. And then it's also to do with fundamentality. Are parts or wholes fundamental? Which one is the more fundamental? Which one is prior to the other? And so I'll sort of break this down a little bit more so people can understand. So priority monism, the most basic level, says that the whole is ontologically prior to its parts. So that is the most base level understanding of monism. The whole is fundamental and the parts are derivative. Priority pluralism says the opposite. That says the parts are prior to the whole. The parts are fundamental and the whole is derivative. Now, the general view that people take, the general view that we assume is priority pluralism, it seems to be that a lot of people believe that it's the parts that are more fundamental and the parts then construct the whole. So a way to think about this is just looking at your body. It seems to be the case that my body exists because my parts have been put together. And it's the parts then that are ontologically prior to the whole. But monism flips this on its head and says, actually, it seems to be the case that what's prior in the structure of reality is the whole itself, and it's not the parts. And the way that it sort of cashes this out is within using the example of the universe, or using that as the entity that's postulated. So priority pluralism and monism both agree, and probably the only thing they agree on is that there is a universe. The universe exists. This could be the universe, our physical universe, or it could be the multiverse. But there is some physical reality that we can call the universe. That thing exists. And the way now where they sort of divide and where they start, bickering with each other is about how do we cut up the universe? Monism says we keep the universe whole. We don't cut it up at all. But pluralism says, no, we need to cut up the universe into little pieces because it's the little pieces that are fundamental and not the whole itself. So the argument is about how do we cut up the universe? Monism assumes a view that the universe, the totality of reality, is what is fundamental. And then everything that is made up within the universe is derivative. So Schaffer takes a certain view. So I'm using, sorry, just for the audience, it's a bit technical language, but it's good maybe sort of acquiring this vocabulary. But so this view that he assumes is something called substantivalism. Substantivalism. It's always difficult to say. So substantivalism or super substantivalism is the specific view that Schaffer takes. Okay, and substantivalism is the idea that space-time manifold is the single fundamental entity. So the space-time manifold, whatever that is, that's the universe or the multiverse. Space-time and matter is the single fundamental thing. And then everything that makes up space-time is derivative. So ourselves, houses, cars, cows, strange example, and pebbles, all of these things that make up our universe are grounded by the universe itself. The universe is the single fundamental entity, the totality of reality. And everything else, its parts, are the things that are grounded by it. They are derivative. Pluralism, which I was saying to you is basically the opposite, says that actually that's not the case. There is not one single fundamental entity. So there is sort of a rejection of super substantivalism here. There is not one single fundamental entity. What is the fundamental thing? The absolute fundamental thing, as you can see in that image, are what we can call mereological atoms, these little bits and pieces. So in the scientific realm, we normally call them quarks, okay? And it could be something else. It doesn't necessarily have to be quarks, but it's the smallest units of reality, all these bits and pieces. They are the fundamental things that exist, and they compose the universe itself. And so there is not one single fundamental thing, which priority monism says, which is the universe, but there are all a near infinite amount of fundamental things, these small atoms, mereological atoms. They are the things that compose all of reality. And so they are fundamental. And then the parts that they sort of make up, our bodies and the pebbles and the cows and the cars and the universe itself, these things are all derivative entities. They all are grounded by these atoms. And so there is sort of this sort of warring view, sort of in metaphysics. Should we go with monism, that the universe is a single fundamental entity and its parts are derivative entities that are grounded by it? Or should we go with priority pluralism, which is the idea that all of these, all of reality is made up of these small atoms, these mereological atoms that make up all of the larger things within the totality of reality. And so it's about, like I was saying, it's an idea about parts and wholes. And it's the idea about which one is more fundamental. Is it the parts or is it the wholes of the universe itself? And so that's sort of where the argument goes. Sorry, I don't know if you want to jump in, Josh, with any clarification or if it's all...
I was going to suggest, Josh, you go ahead and jump in and provide any clarification that you want to add on this section here, priority monism versus plurality.
Yeah, no, I thought that was a great presentation. Thought it was very clear. I'm just curious now, how do we get to God? What's the final part of the argument here? And then it'll be interesting to see how this final part connects back to those models, because something that occurs to me is that you can think of a God, a supreme foundation of reality, as being a whole that's prior to parts. In fact, I was just having a lovely interview with Philip Goff, who's a leading panpsychist philosopher, and he makes this argument that the sort of original consciousness is the whole that's prior to its parts. But the way in which that will diverge from the particular form of priority monism that you described, Josh, is that Philip is not thinking that the fundamental characterization of the universe is in terms of space and time or geometry. And in fact, actually, this is where, from my reading of the leading physicists who are talking about the nature of quirks in terms of states of an underlying quantum field. What I'm reading is they're also agreeing with this, that the most fundamental description, even of matter, even of our universe, is not actually in terms of spatial and geometric vocabulary. And so there might be an interesting way in which, from different angles of inquiry, there could be a convergence toward this idea of sort of a substance or a foundational reality that is prior even to the parts, where this doesn't preclude theism. In fact, actually, that theists could actually take this on board. And so I'll be very interested to see how this idea fits with the sort of final stage of your argument here.
Yeah, no, that's great. So just sort of going with then, let's say, putting theism now on the table. So we have monism, we have pluralism. I'm taking these to be like the physical options that people can assume. Now, what I call the non-physical or the theological option is the postulation of the existence of God. So theism, the simple claim that there is a God. Now, this can be understood in a myriad of ways, and it has been throughout history, throughout philosophy. People have understood God in certain ways, and they defined it in certain ways. Now, the way I define it is utilizing some of Swinburne's terminology, but sort of trying to reframe it in a certain specific way and utilizing some concepts from contemporary metaphysics. So in the most simple fashion, the way that I define God is as a metaphysically simple omnipotence trope. So metaphysically simple omnipotence trope. Yeah, thank you very much for that, Cameron. So,
Josh, you've just turned me into an atheist. I don't believe in a metaphysically simple omnipotent trope. I'm an atheist now, Josh. Oh no!
We just see. Oh no! People are gonna be angry at me.
A very ambitious definition there.
Yeah. So it is, but I think for myself, because as I'm going to try my best to show in this argument, it best fulfills our criterion. So that's what we should go with that postulation. Sorry, Cameron.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I mean, I will just want to add here that I actually think that your argument does point to the core of my own view. And so for me, what's most interesting about your argument is to see how to translate out the core or the treasures within and see sort of what comes out there. So yeah, and I mean, in the end, you might persuade me. Maybe it will be a trope. But yeah.
Well, and I don't know that it's necessarily incompatible with your view, Josh. So we'll have to see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Awesome. Cameron, can I just have that image up again? That was helpful. So, okay, the way I define God is as a metaphysically simple omnipotence trope. Now, it'll be very sort of important to define those sort of two key terms. So, metaphysically simple and omnipotence trope. So, I'll start with omnipotence trope. Now, a trope is a terminology that's sort of, again, like grounding. You find it throughout contemporary metaphysics. A lot of philosophers have sort of signed up to this idea that reality seems to have these things existing within them called tropes. So these things called tropes are existing within reality and they're evident in some way. And some philosophers will give arguments for them being necessary for us to have certain areas of philosophy to operate within. And so a trope is, now a lot of people will normally take a trope just to be a property, a particular property, a particularized property. So for example, you have redness. Now, I don't know why I said redness because I'm not wearing red, but I'm wearing a gray top. So let's go with gray. So gray can be a universal. So a universal is simply, something which is shared. It's with another entity. So the gray top I have, the grayness of my top is also exemplified by another top that is gray and another top that is gray. So we share it. So we share this sort of color amongst us. And that will normally be what a universal is. And obviously there's ways that we need to be more specific in defining it. But a trope for a lot of philosophers is sort of taken to be a particularized property. So my jumper's grayness. So my jumper has its own particular grayness that is not shared by any other gray top. So if someone had a similar top to myself, their grayness of that top would be different from the grayness of my top. So there's a particular property that's exemplified by each object. And so a lot of philosophers sort of see these things. We have these particularized properties that exist. Now, what I've sort of done is sort of delve deeper into some other metaphysicians who have sort of unearthed a distinction that needs to be made amongst the trope family, that there are two types of tropes that have existed throughout sort of philosophical history, and people who have been studying and sort of arguing for this view, people like D.C. Williams and Keith Campbell, and other individuals. They've sort of seen that there's a distinction in there, and someone who's really brought this out is a person called Robert Garcia and Michael Lowe. Lau, I always struggle and know how to pronounce it. But yeah, we have these two philosophers who have really been explicit in their sort of identification that there are two types of tropes. There are things called modifier tropes and things called module tropes. So modifier and module tropes. Modifier tropes are tropes which are properties, so they're defined as properties of things, and these properties, they make things in a certain way, so they are characterizers. So for example, my top again is gray. It has a modifier trope that's made it gray. So the reason my top is gray is because there is a modifier trope that has modified the color of my top and made it gray. It gives it its character. However, a key thing here is a modifier trope does not have the character that it bestows upon an object. So it gives it, but it doesn't have the grayness itself. So it's not self-exemplifying. But then module tropes are tropes which are not properties. So they're not taken to be properties. They are actually taken to be objects. And they are taken to be self-exemplifying objects. So they are things which have the character that they bestow upon something else. So for example, a good example given by Garcia is a hotness trope. So if I touch a stove, sorry, my English, my stove, people might say, what's a stove? But if I touch a stove and I burn my hand, I'm like, oh my gosh, I've burnt my hand. It's really painful. Now, what caused my hand to be burnt was a module trope, because the module trope is hot itself. It doesn't just give what it doesn't have, but it is hot itself. So a lot of philosophers have said, actually, there's a misconception here. The tropes that we see throughout reality that we want to postulate are actually module tropes, because module tropes are entities that can stand in causal relations. Modifier tropes cannot. They are properties. They are causally inert. But module tropes are things which are not. So, sorry, Cameron, it will be helpful maybe just to have that image up again, the module trope. Yeah, so if you see on the right, a module trope has all of these characteristics. So it's an object. It is self-exemplifying, so it has the character that it bestows. It's a characterizer, so it gives things. It makes things in a certain way. It gives them their character. And it's maximally thin. What that means is that it has a single character. So a hotness trope doesn't have a color as well. It's not a color trope. It can't fulfill that role. And it can't also fulfill the role of something else. It doesn't have that character. It has a single character. And so a lot of philosophers will say all the things that we see within reality, they are made up of bundles of tropes. So you have color tropes, you have hotness tropes, you have all these sort of things that are bundled together to make certain things. And so there are, just taking a track back, there are these two distinctions between tropes, module tropes and modifier tropes. Modifier tropes are properties which are causally inert, and they are not self-exemplifying, even though that they can characterize things. But module tropes are objects which are self-exemplifying, which are characterizers, and which are maximally thin. Now, something just shared between both types of tropes, just the last point on this, is that they are also, by a lot of philosophers, taken to be simple entities. So tropes are things which are identical to their natures. They are not made up of different parts, and they're not made up by things from different ontological categories. They just have a single character that they are identical to. So specifically module tropes, if I have a hotness trope, it's identical to that hotness. It's not made up of a hotness property, but it is identical to that character that it has. So it's simple in a way. It's not made up of parts. And so what I then, sort of taking that distinction in hand, I then say, okay, I believe that we can identify God as a trope itself. So God is a trope, and he's a specific type of trope. He is a module trope, and he's not a modifier trope. Because I think some people who might have heard this before, read the paper, briefly or heard, oh, I've said that God is a trope, it's very important that there's this distinction in hand, because there are tropes that are objects. And also there are tropes that are causally active. They're not causally inert. So God can be a trope, and it doesn't make him into a property that's causally inert. But it actually allows him to be an object which self-exemplifies the nature that he has. And also he can stand in causal relations, so he can do things. And so I think it's very helpful. And I won't go through it now, but in the paper, I sort of go through all the characteristics of tropes and how God can fulfill those specific characteristics. So it's not an ad hoc sort of assumption or postulation, but I'm saying actually God can fulfill these things that makes him into a module trope.
Mm-hmm. Josh, so could you get on board with this?
Well, so I was sort of raised on the tradition that things have properties and things aren't the same thing as the properties that they have. Now, Robert Garcia is a friend of mine from Notre Dame. And actually, the last time I saw him at a conference, he was talking about this sort of theory that he had in terms of tropes, that each one of us, like our souls, is or contains or something like some special, unique trope, even out of God's own nature, making us each unique and very special. Like the self that I am, when I look inward, it's like, oh, it's me. And then you look inward and you're like, oh, that's me. You know, that feeling of me, that your me is unique and special. And it's like, now I don't know for sure if this was his view exactly. It's been a while since I talked to him, but that is a trope that you're acquainted with, even within yourself, or it's connected to a trope that itself is connected all the way back to fundamental reality. Can I be on board with this? I mean, it might come down to vocabulary, because I'm just thinking like, okay, well, I'm fine with thinking of fundamental reality as having causal powers. It's not a modifier, as you say. It would be more of a module. Then I start losing my grip on, well, now why are we calling it a property at this point? I mean, maybe it's just a matter of vocabulary, but I'm sort of losing my grip now on how I think of properties. Peter Van Wagen, my dissertation advisor, he has a wonderful article called A Theory of Properties. And there he stipulates a definition of a property as that which you can say of something. So I can say of you that you're cool, that you're smart, that you're what I can say things that you're wearing a sweater or whatever. I can say those things, and then those things count as properties by definition because I can say them. So is God something that I can say of something? I don't know. I just lose my grip on that. But then maybe your notion of property won't be Van Wagen's. And so then in the end, well, maybe it is just a vocabulary difference. I mean, in substance, I can affirm the things that you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. Just to jump in there, just quickly. Yeah. So what I make sure I make explicit in the paper that when we're referring to module tropes, we are using the term property in a stretched sense.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't really literally call a module trope a property. But what's really interesting is that classical trope theorists, so D.C. Williams, for example, who was sort of the main instigator of trope theory and like the contemporary sort of metaphysical thinking on it, he assumed this view, and all the sort of people that came after him assumed this view when we were talking about classical trope theory, that they are things that make up bundles, but they're not really exemplified by that thing. So they would say that you're bundles of tropes, and you're not. There's not like a substrata or a substance that exemplifies these things. They actually make up the bundle that you are. So they're compresent in a certain way. And so,
or what it is to exemplify just is to be a constituent of. It's sort of an analysis of exemplification in terms of constituent. Yeah,
exactly. Right. So they would say that. So maybe I think he wasn't explicit in using the term object, and Garcia and others have been. But he was, and I think Garcia in his work on this was saying it's just clear that actually they were assuming, the majority of classical trope theorists were assuming the module view more than the modifier view. The modifier view was actually something that's taken a hold more recently in our terminology. But when we actually look at the classical trope theorists, they were going more with the module view, that it seems to be objects that they even say that there's a pot-hole relation or a constitution relation, as you were saying, sort of, but it's not even like this instantiation as we see sort of universals and things like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting, but it's obviously a strange view, but I think there. So, for example, going to Swinburne again, I remember in his Christian God book, and when he's sort of looking at divine simplicity, he's like, "Oh no, I don't like divine simplicity. Okay, there's problems here." He says that he can latch onto the idea that God is a property instance.
Yeah.
So that's quite interesting, and I don't think some people might doubt his reading of Aquinas, but he was trying to say Aquinas might take that view as well, that God might be a property instance, and
Yeah.
so.
Can I just jump in here? If a property instance is that which has the property, so I'm human. So human is my property that I have, and I'm an instance of human. I'm that which has the property.
Yeah.
But then that, of course, leaves wide open the analysis of that which has the property.
Yes. Yeah.
And I take it that trope theorists are trying to say something more than the sort of traditional substratum theorists who say that there's just this something that has the property, but it's not itself a property. It's almost like the way that I think about it is, for the trope theorist, if there's a property like the color of gray here, it's that there's a particular grayness that like is just what gray looks like when you see it, and it's just particular. There's not something else like behind it that has the thing that you see when you see the gray.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. And
Yeah.
so if we leave that open, if we say, there's just an instance of a property, and we leave open our analysis of instance, whether it's trope or substratum or something else, then maybe we can still have everything you're describing about the instance without maybe loading it in with more than what we need for your argument, perhaps.
Yeah. So I think my justification for sort of going with that more specific and latching on to this sort of more loaded view is, as we sort of proceed forward with the argument, is the explanatory virtues that you see with it. So it fulfilling the criteria better than something. So I think if I was to take a more, let's say, generalized view and less specific, it might not fit as well with the criteria. But yeah, as probably as we proceed forward, we can probably flesh that out a little bit more.
As I think about it, I think our difference might be fundamentally in terms of vocabulary. And this really is at the edge of my thinking. I've been thinking about these things, again, a lot as I've been thinking about the nature of consciousness. My wife and I, we were talking about your article for like a couple hours last night before we went to bed, sort of dig into the jewels of it. And she's great. I'm just asking her questions, and her insights are helping me to sort my thoughts on this. And there's something about a mind first ontology where mentality itself makes realities that I think can actually fit with your own analysis of fundamental reality, being like simple, and then its characteristics that we ascribe to it, or even that it ascribes to itself, are generated through mental activities. And those mental activities aren't just based on nothing, they're based on it. So, because this is always kind of my biggest problem with conceptualism is like, well, how can you just like make up with your mind what the properties are? But no, you're making up with your mind sort of a window of awareness through your own lens of limitation. Where it is something that can only give you what it is, but through your lens of interpretation. So you could think of it as, let's say, simple, and then its quote characteristics are, it's like there's this cooperation of you thinking about it through your own window of your concepts, and then with it, that which you're seeing. And so this allows you then to have, let's say, maybe conceptual, you could call them conceptual distinctions, but they're based on a real thing. Because this has always been my most difficult problem with a kind of divine simplicity is, how can you say there aren't real distinctions between the properties and the ultimate reality? And what I hear you trying to point to, Josh, is a model on which ultimate reality is just purely simple, and the distinctions come from maybe windows of awareness of that reality, maybe even its own awareness of itself. And this is where I am completely at the edge of my current analysis. And I'm not quite sure sort of how to paint the details, but your work contributes to me going deeper and thinking about this.
Oh, thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you for that. And yeah, I think just briefly, it'll be good just to understand sort of that first half of the definition of God. So metaphysically simple. So as I was saying, I take God to be a trope. Sorry, Cameron, is it possible just to get the image up? Not the module trope one, the one after that, that has all of it, has a double. So yeah, that one. So I take God, as I was saying before, to be a trope. Tropes are generally taken to be metaphysically simple. The way I understand that, though, is in the strongest sense that all of the attributions that we make of God are numerically identical to him. So God doesn't exemplify properties. As a trope, he doesn't have properties that he exemplifies or instantiates. He is all of the characterizations that we make of him. So if we say he's omnipotent or omnipresent, he's perfectly good, he's perfectly free, he's omniscient, all of these things are things that are numerically identical to him. Now, a lot of people might be scratching their hair. I don't have any hair, but some of you might say, "Well, how does that make sense?" I mean, how can all these things? And this has been sort of, we can call maybe the hard problem of divine simplicity. How
Mhm.
can God have all of these attributions that we make of him that are numerically identical to him, and he doesn't have these properties? Now, the way I sort of understanding, and I think it's probably not good to go into depth with it, but I will sort of just direct people to a more substantiated paper that I've written on it. But I sort of take all of the characteristics that God has. So, for example, his omniscience and perfect freedom to be aspects of him. So I utilize the concept of an aspect.
Mhm.
Now, this was put forward by a person called Donald Baxter, so a philosopher who's worked on this issue for quite a while. He put forward this idea of aspect theory, or theories of aspects. And aspects are just basically particular ways in which an entity is. And they normally show up in self-differing scenarios. So I'm just going to give a brief example that will help people sort of understand this notion of an aspect. So, for example, let's say we go with a person called David. And David, he's a father and he's a philosopher. And David, one weekend, he's just sort of realized that he's got a keynote speech that he needs to finish because he has to deliver it on Monday. And he's promised the organizers of the conference, they've got all of the marketing material. David's going to speak. Everyone is geared up and ready to hear him. And they're like, yeah, we can't wait. And posting online that we can't wait to hear him, his new speech. But then David is saying to himself, oh my gosh, I haven't actually written the speech yet. What am I going to do? And he's thinking to himself, okay, I've got to dedicate this whole weekend to getting this speech done. Nothing can distract me. I've got to be in my office. But then, his kids, so he's got two kids that run into his room and say, Daddy, do you know what? I got A stars in my A-level exam. So in England, A-levels are like the big graduation exams that high school students sit. And so A star is like the highest you can get. And so they run into his room and say, oh, we've got A stars, Daddy. You're taking us to the camping trip that you promised us. We're geared up. We've got our camping gear. And so the kids run into the room and they say, Dad, come on, are you ready? We're ready to go. And he's thinking to himself, oh my gosh, I forgot that I promised to my kids that I'm going to, go to this camping trip if they get good results. But I've also promised the organizers of this conference that I'm going to deliver this keynote speech. And so he's torn in this scenario. He wants to do one, but he wants to do the other. He doesn't want to do one, and he doesn't want to do the other. So he's in a self-differing scenario. Now, it seems to be the case. So I've just used an example that I came up with, but it's based on similar things that Baxter has said, that we are in these scenarios quite regularly where we're caught between two sort of ways of doing something. I want to do this and I want to do other things. Now, the idea here is that David, insofar as he's a philosopher, doesn't want to go on the camping trip. He wants to go and complete his speech. But David, insofar as he's a father, wants to wants to go on the camping trip, and so wants to fulfill his promise. And so what we have are two characteristics that are contradictory. Doesn't want to go on the camping trip and does want to go on the camping trip. And so these are sort of warring within him. Now, the key idea that Baxter sort of brings in is that these are evidence of things called aspects. And aspects are captured by the phrase insofar as. So sort of in the theological context, the qua sort of phrase. So David, insofar as he's a philosopher, wants to do this, has this characteristic. And David, insofar as he's a father, has the opposite characteristic. And so we are in these scenarios all the time. But why there is no contradiction in these scenarios, because we're not saying David wants to go on the trip and doesn't want to go on the trip. What we're saying is David, insofar as he fulfills this certain role, wants to do this, and David, insofar as he fills this role, doesn't want to do this. Now, the insofar as I said, captures aspects of an entity, and you can find this in all different sort of scenarios. Now, just quickly applying this in a theological context, what I say then is that all of the, sorry, Cameron, just to be helpful with that image just being up. So all of these attributes, all of these characterizations that we give to God, him being omniscient, perfectly free, good, omnipresent, and omnipotent, these are all aspects of God. So let's say the base sort of characterization that God has as a module trope is him being omnipresent. So he is a limitlessly powerful trope. That's what he is. So he's omnipresent. Now, what I then say, take each of the attributes to be, I take them all to be aspects of this omnipotence trope that God is. So God, so let's say omnipotence, insofar as it is the ability to know of all true propositions, is what we identify as omniscience. Or omnipotence, insofar as it is the it is the ability to be cognizant of and causally active at each point of space, we take that to be omnipresent. And let's say omnipotence insofar as it is the ability to perform the best action if there is one, good actions and no bad actions, that's what we take goodness to be. So each of these things are simply roles in which omnipotence fulfills. Now, this is then sort of formulating Swinburne's frameworks. I think Swinburne was onto something here, because Swinburne takes, in his latest Coherence of Theism, he takes all of the properties of God to be entailed by omnipotence. Now, what I do is saying there's not an entailment relation here. There is an identity relation. So all of these things are omnipotent insofar as. Now, just to clarify a point, aspects are numerically identical to the other aspects and to their bearers. So what we have here then is a numerically identical identity relation between each of these aspects. So that's something I didn't bring up, before, but in that example of David insofar as he's a philosopher, and David insofar as he's a father, they are just simply David. They're David insofar as these things. He is identical to each of these things. And so what we have here is there being a numerical identity relation between the aspects. And so we also apply that then within this theological context. We say omnipotence insofar as it's each of these characterizations of it are simply omnipotence. They are simply just omnipotence, but we are making a qualitative distinction between them by saying it's the ability to do X, Y, or Z. And so God then has aspects. These aspects are numerically identical to him as an omnipotence trope. And so what we have then is God being qualitatively distinct in many ways, but he is numerically identical to each of these qualifications that we make of him because they are aspects. Now, this is a lot to, for people to obviously understand and try and digest. But I would say if people want to take this sort of further, because it's not key to the argument, but if people want to take this sort of further, a way that I try and conceptualize divine simplicity, please go and look at the paper that I've written on it. I don't know if Cameron, you can link it later or something, if people are interested.
I just wanted to say that I think, and this is a way to marry both of y'all's views, is to say instead of an omnipotence trope, maybe God is a perfection trope. Like maybe that's a better way to put it, because I think that Josh,
or a
you might agree.
Perfection instance, and we leave open whether the instance is to be analyzed in terms of a trope. I want to kind of leave that open, and then the other way that I would maybe paint a different picture, and I want to see if this is still consistent with your argument, because I like what you say, Josh, that this isn't maybe all essential to the argument. You have other reasons for believing that the aspects are identical to each other. But that's like a hard part for me, to say that omnipotence and omniscience are, as aspects, are literally identical. But a different way that I could think about it is maybe these are aspects, they're different like windows into the same instance of perfection, as you say, Cameron, or they're just windows into God. And the windows are literally distinct from each other. These are different aspects or ways of God manifesting or being. So for example, omnipotence is the window is God through the window of power. Omniscience is God through the window of knowledge. Moral perfection is God through the window of goodness. And so maybe our own concepts give us the windows to look at God. But the idea here is that these are really distinct aspects from each other, but they're pointing to a common core, which is, and this goes to your argument, Josh, which is the ground of those aspects. This is something I've been thinking a lot about lately, is how the fundamental reality could be itself the ground of its aspects, so that truly the foundational reality is simple, because its very aspects are not foundational. They're grounded in it, if that makes sense. This has been a hard thing for me to come to. It's taken kind of a Gestalt shift, because for so much of my career, I thought of reality as sort of exploded by Plato's heaven with all these abstract things that are all sort of equally fundamental. But then I began to run into the sort of simplicity problem of that, having all these fundamental things, as well as sort of my own thinking about, like, well, why are those things there? It's not just how many there are. It's like, well, why those? And then my work on the nature of fundamental reality as having these positive aspects of knowledge, power, and goodness. And I'm thinking, why are they all positive? That seems like this happy coincidence. There needs to be like a deeper explanation. And so for these sorts of reasons, I've experienced kind of like a Gestalt shift, where it's like, oh, well, maybe I can actually think of the fundamental reality, that ground reality, as grounding its aspects, to use your language. And then this allows me to leave open whether those aspects are identical with each other, or whether they're really distinct from each other, whether they are, how to understand their distinction. Are they conceptually distinct? Is it in terms of mentality or something else? But just leave open as much as we can. And then your argument still can lead us to this sort of unified, ultimate, singular root of the rest of reality.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that would be a way of kind of marrying our perspectives here.
I think this will be probably the only pushback I give against you. My only thing would be is that if you're using the term grounding in like the literal sense of a grounding relation, the problem that you have is that there seems to be the case that it wouldn't be, as I think you're not arguing for, it wouldn't be an identity relation between the aspects or attributes, because grounding is irreflexive. So it has a formal property that's different from identity, which is reflexive. And so the issue that you'll then have is that this argument won't be able to work as well, because you won't fulfill simplicity in the way that I'm trying to, the criterion of simplicity in the way that I'm trying to get to, saying that God is qualitatively simple in that he doesn't even have properties, because each of these things are aspects of him. They're numerically identical to him. And so why I'm trying to really hold as strong as possible to divine simplicity in the strongest sense of the word is because I think it's going to really, be the nail in the coffin for the argument, or for the other things that we look at, because we are allowed to then postulate literally the simplest entity that could exist. There is nothing more simple than this. And just to sort of warrant why the aspects are numerically identical is because we are, at the end of the day, when we are talking about aspects, we are just taking them to be qualitatively differing, but numerically identical particular ways that an entity is. Because it doesn't be the case that insofar as I am philosopher and insofar as I am father, these are two different parts of me that make me what I am. It just seems to be that then Josh, but Josh fulfills this role. This role is Josh, and Josh is that role as well. And so what Baxter, so this is not my own sort of take on it, it's trying to say, going with what Baxter argues for in the most general context that has nothing to do with theology, aspects are taken to be numerically identical. They qualitatively differ. And so we won't go into it, but Leibniz's law doesn't apply to aspects. And so they can qualitatively differ, yet be numerically identical. And so why I want to hold to that, though, is because as we move forward, we would see that actually allows us to have all of the criterions, and specifically simplicity, in hand here.
Yeah, Josh. So help me think about this, because help me see why you're thinking of your view as simpler. The way that I'm thinking about it is that we still have a very simple view of the foundational ungrounded reality. It's simple. It's not composed of properties or parts or anything like this. It's not made by its aspects. In fact, it goes the other way. It grounds its aspects. So if you're thinking about simplicity in terms of the simplest fundamental entity or the simplest theory of the fundamental entity, it seems to me that our views on the table are identical, because the
Yeah.
simplest fundamental entity, at least on this model, is just God. And it doesn't include God's properties either. God's properties are grounded in God. Yeah.
But would you take these aspects to what type of entities would they be, or would you what would they be in like an
So
ontological
I'm not
sense?
sure.
Yeah.
That's a hard question. But I'm happy to use your language here. There are just
Yeah.
sort of ways of this thing manifesting itself.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And,
I
and
think we're
then as
saying
far as your criteria, sort of what's in play here is
Yeah.
what's the simplest account of the most fundamental reality?
Yeah.
And well, if there's only one most fundamental reality, it's the thing itself, the instance of all the aspects. And because here maybe is where we might agree. The instance of each of those aspects is identical.
Yeah.
The instance of omnipotence is identical with the instance of omniscience. And then the instance is the ground of the aspect itself. The ground of the thing it's an instance of, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No,
And I do think this is a difference. I think these models are different. But what I'm thinking is that I'm not seeing that these models are different in a way that's relevant to your argument. So kind of like my goal is to see how your argument can allow maybe more models on the table.
Yeah. And I think that's great, and that's important, because the argument I'm putting forward here is not wedded to the view of divine simplicity that I assume. It's just sort of to deal with an objection that someone could raise, saying, why am I even going to take this as a plausible hypothesis? Because metaphysical simplicity is nonsense. So it's just saying, actually, there's a way to make sense of it. So it doesn't derail the argument. However, any view of metaphysical simplicity, as long as we can sort of coherently explain it, can be utilized in this argument. That's sort of the main thing to understand.
So let me do this. I want to situate the audience, because if you've just joined us, which I know that one person in particular has just joined us, Parker from Parker's Pensies. Go check out his channel, by the way. He just joined us, and to orient him and the audience, for people who are kind of wondering, what are we talking about? Why are we here right now? This is how we got here. So first of all, we started talking about some phenomena in the world. There's basically two, so non-fundamental entities, and then this grounding relation. Okay, so we've got these two different phenomena, and then we're asking, well, what's the best explanation of this? Then after that, we looked at different inductive criteria for assessing the explanatory virtues or maybe vices of different alternate explanations that we want to use in order to explain the phenomena in question, the non-fundamental entities and their grounding relations. So then we basically just established the criteria first. We talked through them a little bit, and then at this point we're trying to get to the point where we're going to start to assess the different alternatives. But what we've done so far is we've been looking at Dr. Sijuwade's specific way of formulating theism, of understanding God's nature, so to speak. So that's where we've kind of paused and been sitting at for the last maybe 30, 45 minutes, is just looking at this, because it's a very unique way of looking at it. It's a very modern way. It's a very new way of looking at or understanding God's nature. And it's just worth talking about. It's worth focusing on, because the reason why it's so important to, I think, focus on this part of this argument is because if you can establish this view of God's nature, then it's going to allow you to make some of the moves that Dr. Sijuwade wants to make in the next section, in ruling out these other alternatives as having some, not as many of the explanatory virtues as his theistic hypothesis. Anyways, I hope that was helpful to situate you where we're currently at, but I think it'd be time. I think, Sijuwade, you said that you've got you can go maybe another half hour?
No, I can go a bit longer, but I think moving forward now to sort of see how everything sort of ties together, I think will be good. Yeah.
Perfect. Let's do it. Yeah. So just let me know when you'd like me to put up that last illustration.
So just understanding now, we've got these three explanations. So we have priority monism, priority pluralism, we have theism, the way I've defined it. We also have the primitive option, where we just take the grounding relation to be fundamental, just focusing on that phenomena for now. And so now we need to assess the worth of each of these explanations according to the criteria that we assumed previously. Now, focusing first on theism and going through the three criteria. So that is specifically criteria of predictive power, criteria of background knowledge, and criteria of simplicity, given just for now that we're sort of dropping the criterion of scope. So how well does theism fulfill this criteria? I believe it fulfills it extraordinarily well. And why it does this, let's go with, the phenomena, the grounding relation, the relation that connects all the entities within the fundamental structure of reality. Now, what I believe is that when we look at the criterion of predictive power, which is that the explanation, the entity that we postulate, should lead us to expect the data that we have. I believe theism does that for the relation of grounding and for the non-fundamental entities as well. Now, why it does this, I believe, is because I assume a principle that I believe is intuitive and I don't believe is being refuted, even though I would say it's dropped out of philosophical sort of dialogue. But something dropping out of dialogue doesn't mean it's being refuted, because it might return. And this is the diffusiveness principle, which is a principle that you find throughout the work of individuals like Plato. It was also argued for by Aquinas and Bonaventure and others. It's the idea that goodness is diffusive of itself. Goodness and things that are good, they try to manifest and spread their goodness in any way that they can. Now, given that God is perfectly good, that's one of his characteristics, one of his aspects, one of his attributes. God is perfectly good. That means he would do good things if there is a possibility to do it, and he would not do any bad things. So given God's perfect goodness, he would seek to diffuse his goodness according to this principle. And the way he can diffuse this is by bringing about other entities that exist. Because assuming that I think it's plausible to assume existence is a good thing. Entities existing are good. And so if there is an entity that is just going to spread its goodness in any way possible and a myriad of different ways, I believe that one way it would do this is by bringing about other entities that exist as well. And it will necessarily do this. Okay, so it will necessarily diffuse its goodness. And so what God will then do is that God would bring about all of these entities, and that given that they're brought about, they are non-fundamental, because they will then have a dependence relation upon God bringing them about. Now, you could say that there are different relations. God causes these things to come about, and then he grounds them in existence. Because it doesn't seem to be right that God will just diffuse his goodness, cause this thing, and then cause it to go out of existence, and cause it again, and cause it to go out of existence. It seems to be the case that if God is diffusing his goodness, he will then ground these things in existence. And so you will have him grounding these entities. And so there would be other non-fundamental entities that are necessarily existing. But what we also then have coming along is not just these non-fundamental entities from God's diffusing of his goodness, but we also have the relation of grounding, because he's grounding them in existence. So we have the two phenomena necessarily coming about from God's perfect goodness and the working of this diffusive principle. So what we can then say is that if we assume this entity to exist, we can expect there to be, to an extraordinarily high level, there to be these other entities that exist as well. They would be non-fundamental. And there will be a grounding relation, because they'll be grounded by God. There'll be this relation that exists as well. And so there will even be an entailment. So we will have extremely strong fulfillment of this criterion. Now, some key things. So people are saying, well, is God necessarily creating, bringing about things? I don't define what these non-fundamental entities are, even though we started off by looking at economics and all these sort of things. In this stage of the argument, it can be whatever. It doesn't necessarily have to be our creation, our universe. It can be whatever is non-fundamental. God is going to spread his goodness and bring it about. And there's another paper that will come out later where I sort of cash this out and say what the entities are. But for the argument now, he's just going to ground in existence these non-fundamental entities, and he will necessarily do this. And so we can expect there to be a grounding relation, if there is a God, and these non-fundamental entities. Okay, and then just quickly going on to the second criterion, which is background knowledge. Now, this is where the definition of God that I've given plays a big role, because I've taken God to be a trope. Now, tropes are regularly, as I said before, accepted widely within the field of philosophy. They play enormous roles in certain areas. And in the paper, if people read through it, I've quoted and listed all of the philosophers who have affirmed and utilized the notion of the trope in their theorizing. But also they play big roles in other sort of areas of concern within philosophy. So debates about realism when it comes to properties and nominalism, tropes play a massive role in that. But they also play certain roles in the philosophy of physics. So some philosophers have utilized it to help people understand things like special theory of relativity and other things like that. They play a certain role. And there's other areas. I've brought up substantialism, and I brought that up sort of in priority monism framework, but philosophers also utilize tropes in that sort of context as well when they're talking about space-time. So tropes generally are widely accepted. Not to say everyone says, tropes are the way that we need to go about things, but it's something that's found and theorized about outside of the field of theology. And so this is very key, and a distinguishing point for myself and Swinburne is because Swinburne, in his works, he would define God as an omnipresent spirit. Now, I would say, and you can obviously come back to me if I'm wrong here, but spirits won't be things which are regularly theorized about outside of, let's say maybe philosophy of mind and theology. But in other areas, they're not normally brought up as a theoretical option to explain data. But with a trope, tropes they're widely accepted within the field of philosophy. And so what I have with this specific definition is the fulfillment of the criterion of background knowledge. But someone who assumes maybe the view of God as a spirit might struggle to go and say that actually fits with our background knowledge. And some philosophers have pushed back on Swinburne with that. And so that's why I'm saying the trope idea is very key in trying to fulfill this idea of background knowledge, which other ideas and other theories might not do so well as. And so, that's sort of the fulfillment of background knowledge. And then just moving to simplicity quickly, given that God is metaphysically simple, he does not have any properties. And so what we have is God being quantitatively simple and qualitatively simple. God is quantitatively simple because we're only postulating one entity, God. And he's qualitatively simple because God doesn't have any properties. So what I'm even saying here is that God has zero properties. And as I said before, that criterion says it should have the fewest properties possible, or the fewest fundamental properties. Well, actually, if God is metaphysically simple, he doesn't even have any properties at all. He has zero properties. So that's the fewest fulfillment. And so again, that's a distinguishing thing with Swinburne, because Swinburne would take God to have properties. He will say he has the fewest amount of properties, but I'm even going further to say God doesn't even have properties, given that he's numerically identical to each of the attributions made of him. And he also falls into one kind, which is the kind trope. And so you have one entity falling into one kind who has zero properties. And so I would say that's the simplest explanation that you can give. I don't know what could be any simpler. You lose him being one entity, then you're not postulating anything. You lose him being one kind, and again, you're not postulating anything because something has to be an inhabitant or an exemplifier or whatever of the kind. And so what we have is a simplest entity that you can postulate. So I'm saying God is the simplest explanation, qualitatively and quantitatively, of the existence of the grounding relation and of the non-fundamental entities, and he fits very well with our background knowledge as well. But what we see when we come to priority monism, pluralism, is that is not so. So with predictive power, monism and pluralism fails because we shouldn't expect there, just focusing for now on the grounding relation, we shouldn't expect there to be a grounding relation if priority monism and pluralism is true. And the reason being is because what's postulated by these theories is not actually a relation of grounding, it's a relation of parthood. What it says is that all of the entities that exist within the layered structure of reality are parts of the whole, the universe, if we take monism. Or what we say is that the atoms, they make up as parts all of the material objects that we see. So what's postulated is a relation of parthood or composition, and it's not a relation of grounding, even though Schaffer uses that language. And we would say parthood and grounding do not have the same formal properties. So someone has to give good reason to say that given that there is this fundamental universe, or given that there are these fundamental atoms, we should also have a grounding relation that connects them to all of the things within the layered structure of reality. but there needs to be independent reason, and that hasn't been given. So all you can postulate as an entailment is a relation of parthood or composition and not a relation of grounding. You do have the non-fundamental entities existing, so it does explain that. You expect them to be there, but you don't expect the grounding relation. So for that second phenomena, it doesn't really explain that at all. It fails when it comes to predictive power. And then going to background knowledge, and this is sort of the more difficult one to cash out, but the idea here is that monism and pluralism do not fit very well with our background knowledge because they transgress some principles that we take to be correct and assumed widely by philosophers, and they also commit us to certain controversial principles that we wouldn't want to be part of our background knowledge and are things that we reject. So two principles that they fail to specifically, well, actually, let's go with the controversial one. The one that they, if you assume the truth of monism and pluralism, you're committed to, specifically when it comes to pluralism, is the idea or the principle of basically unrestricted composition. So if you believe that there are all these mereological atoms that make up all of reality, then the question that someone has is, why do they make up material objects? Why are we not just having all these atoms scattered together? Why do they come together to make up bodies and make up tables and make up chairs? Why do they do that? Well, what you have to be committed to is something like the principle of unrestricted composition, which says that there is no restriction to composition. Any plurality of things makes up a whole, makes up something. Now, the problem with this principle is that it's very controversial. And why it is because it's not intuitive at all. Because if you hold to the principle of unrestricted composition, then myself, Josh, Cameron, and Donald Trump's nose all make up a whole, which seems to be very strange. Why should a nose over there and two people who are not even together make up some whole? But any plurality of things make up something. And so a lot of philosophers say it just doesn't seem to fit with our intuition if we hold to the principle of unrestricted composition. It seems to be problematic. And I quoted in the article, some philosopher actually says there are so many problems with this principle that if you hold to it, you're going to have to stomach so many other things as well, that it's better just to say that composition is restricted. So then the question is, why should the atoms make up anything? It doesn't seem like they should, unless you hold to this principle, which is controversial. So does it actually fit well with our background knowledge? And then also with the idea of monism, the problem that you have is that monism, some philosophers have argued that it seems to be refuted or it's open to refutation by our contemporary physics. So the idea here is that monism doesn't fit well with another area of knowledge, which is contemporary physics, because there are certain theories and research projects in, I think if I'm correct, sorry, just off the top of my head. So specific theories about gravity and about fundamental reality. So people have looked at certain areas, so the general theory of relativity and certain things like that, and they've come to the conclusion in these research projects, within the field of physics, that our reality seems to have two layers. There is physical reality and there's fundamental reality. And what they are saying is that our physical reality emerges from the fundamental layer of reality. Now, what that then means is that the fundamental layer of reality is non-spatial. So what is argued for here is that whatever is fundamental is not spatial. But priority monism, as I sort of cashed it out, and Schaffer's view and what he's cashed out, is that fundamental reality is spatial. It is spatio-temporal reality. It's a spatio-temporal manifold. That is what fundamental reality is. But contemporary physics and some important research projects in it are actually saying the fundamental structure of reality, we don't know what it is yet, but it's definitely not spatial. It doesn't include the spatio-temporal manifold. That is an emergent thing. Mm-hmm. And so what we then have is that if you assume priority monism, and certain philosophers who have argued for this are saying we need to rethink priority monism. And maybe priority monism, you don't have to take whatever is a single fundamental reality to be spatial. Maybe it's something else. And so they're saying that's maybe the way to go. But if you're taking as it is, The problem is, does it actually fit with what's going on with physics and the philosophy of physics as well? It seems to not fit very well. And the quote I give in that paper is, he says, it's actually open to refutation if you hold to this view. So monism, pluralism, the problem that you have is if you take it, you're not going to fit very well with the contemporary physics and the monist view, or if you take it, you're not going to fit very well with our intuitive understanding of the world, because you have to hold to this very controversial principle. But you don't have that with theism. And the thing is, background knowledge doesn't seem to be met by this. So I've been talking for ages, Josh. I don't know if you want to jump in or you just want me to close the chapter and finish the assessment.
There's so much there. And if you have sort of a final piece you want to add, go for it, and then I can interact.
Perfect. So monism and pluralism, sorry, I've sped through it but there are little pieces that people need to understand. And so probably reading the article will be helpful. But monism, pluralism doesn't seem to fit well with our background knowledge. It doesn't lead us to expect there to be a grounding relation, even though it does for the non-fundamental entities. But there shouldn't be any grounding relation. There should be a parthood relation. So it doesn't seem to sort of fit very well there. Primitivism, I'm not going to go into it really, but I also argue in the paper that it seems to transgress certain principles with our background knowledge. So principles of recombination. And it also doesn't fit very well with something called the purity principle, which is being put forward by Ted Sider. So again, we seem to have a lack of fit with things which are accepted within wider fields of philosophy. So primitivism, background knowledge problems, and also priority monism and pluralism, we have background knowledge problems. And also we shouldn't expect there to be a grounding relation given the purity principle as well. So you also have predictive power problems for the primitive option, but I won't go into that. So just to sort of finish this, when we get to simplicity, which is the last criterion, it seems to be the case that monism, pluralism, and primitivism all fail when it comes to quantitative and or qualitative simplicity. So if you go with, for example, primitivism, and you say there are these relations of grounding that exist fundamentally, they're just there. The problem that you have is that you have quantitative simplicity problems because you have to postulate a myriad of relations to even fulfill the role of there being a layered structure of reality. For there to be any number of entities, there have to be a number of grounding relations. So you're going to have loads of tokens of these relations. So you're not postulating one relation, you're postulating many relations. And I also make a distinction, which I won't go into, but there are different kinds of grounding relations as well. So you seem to also have a qualitative problem because you have to postulate different kinds of grounding relations and not just different tokens. So you seem to have quantitative and qualitative problems when it comes to simplicity with the primitive option. But then also with monism and pluralism, you seem to have the same issues. With monism, you're postulating one entity. So you get quantitative simplicity. There's one fundamental entity, the space-time manifold, which is the universe. However, you don't have qualitative simplicity because within the universe, you have all of these entities which are propertied. And so I didn't go into it, but within this substantivalist view of monism, the properties of each material object within the universe are pinned onto the universe itself. So the universe has these properties. It's not just me, but it's the universe as well, which has these properties. So then all the myriad of material objects that make up the universe, and that could be a multiverse as well, all of those properties are properties of the universe. And so you're not having qualitative simplicity because you're going to have there being many properties, not few or zero properties. And then also you have it falling into more than one kind. The universe has to be a substance that then instantiates its properties. So what you have are substances and attributes. So you're committed to two kinds. Simplicity, you didn't have that when it came to that case with theism, but you have two kinds being postulated by priority monism. So you don't have qualitative simplicity, even though you might have quantitative simplicity. Priority pluralism, again, you have a problem, but it's the other way around. You don't have quantitative simplicity because you postulate a near infinite amount of atoms that are going to make up the universe and all of the things within it. And so what you're going to have then is that you have a myriad of these entities, all of these things. You don't have few entities, you have many entities, even though the atoms are simple, because I do in the paper, I show that the atoms are tropes themselves. So they are simple. So you have qualitative simplicity, but you don't have quantitative because you need a myriad. So taking all of that into account, What we have then is there's a failing literally on each of these points, each of the criterion for these explanations. They fail, when it comes to predictive power, background knowledge, and simplicity. But what I've tried to show is that you don't have that with theism as defined in the way I have. You have theism being the simplest explanation, one entity, zero properties, one kind, that leads us to expect the data, the grounding relation, and the non-fundamental entities in the layered structure of reality. And given that God is also trope, he fits very well with our background knowledge, and we are not committed to any controversial principles in affirming his existence. And so what we have then, I believe, is a fulfillment. So sorry, Cameron, last point. If you can just put up that image of the last one where God and priority monism and pluralism are there. Yeah, so what I then believe is, because given that the theism hypothesis, the theistic explanation, fulfills the criteria better than the available options on the table, we need to descend further down from the physics category. We need to go to a theological category and postulate the existence of God. And so the fulfillment of that criteria allows us to do that. And so just looking lastly on the right image, I said before, this doesn't mean that you have to do away with priority monism or pluralism. You can be a priority pluralist, but what you have to say is that you're not postulating all of these mereological atoms that make up everything to be fundamental. There is a God who grounds their existence. Or if you take the priority monist view and you say the universe is this single, entity, that everything else is a derivative part, then you have to say, yeah, that's fine, you can go with that. But there is a God who grounds that entity because he is the fundamental thing, given the fulfillment of the criteria. Okay, I think I need some water. Sorry, yeah, I've come to that. All right.
Yeah, we all need a break too. We all just need to go lay down for a little while.
Little rest.
So Josh, pick up wherever you'd like. There's I think about 20 minutes of content for you to parse through. Yeah. So just wherever you'd like to start.
So thank you, Cameron. And thank you, Josh. I was thinking of sort of a metaphor to describe kind of in a big picture way, kind of what you're doing. So the metaphor I came up with is you're going and you're finding among the philosophers these treasures, and maybe treasure is the wrong word, these planks of ideas that are respected. And then you're building a bridge out of the philosopher's planks to get to this interesting conclusion about the existence of God. And then as I'm watching you do this, and it's a beautiful thing that you're doing, you're looking at the sort of the best work in the latest cutting edge metaphysics. You're building this grand bridge. And I'm thinking, you've got more pieces than you need. The bridge is, it's longer than it needs to be. And it's actually more narrow than it needs to be. And this isn't an objection to the bridge. It's rather an invitation to my own mind to think, okay, is there another way of building out your bridge that uses fewer pieces and maybe is even a little wider, sort of allows more options in the end? So for example, in the end, we don't necessarily have to say that the instance of omnipotence is a trope. We can just leave open. It's an instance of omnipotence. It's prior to the things it grounds. We can even leave open priority monism. And I want to point on this, draw a little bit of this point out in a moment. But just kind of the big picture, what's going on is that I think there might be a way of building your bridge with fewer pieces and with sort of a wider ending. And that's kind of the most interesting thing for me to think about. Even mereological universalism, just as it happens in my book on the correspondence theory of truth, I do give a kind of argument that in order for all true propositions to have a truth maker, that the truth maker would be composed of things, so that even a proposition about your nose, my nose, and Cameron's nose, if that's true, it's going to correspond to a truth maker that's composed of those noses. And so it would be a composite object. It's just not the kind of composite object that we normally think of in terms of something that has its own causal powers. Now, in the end, I'm not actually committed to that view, but I'm just thinking that I want to leave that open. I want to leave open mereological universalism. I want to leave open whether the whole is prior to its parts. And I think we can. I think the core of your argument. So tell me what you think about this, Josh. Here, I was thinking, how would I summarize the core of your argument? I was thinking maybe it would be something like this. The sort of simplest explanation of the data, which includes the causal structure of dependent things, or the dependent structure of reality and grounding itself, is going to be in terms of something that has power. Okay. And if we want to say how much power, the simplest theory is that it's just omnipotent. And from there, we can maybe deduce some of these other attributes. Like if it's got omnipotence, then it's got the power to know. And so you can get some of those, but we can sort of leave that open as well. We have this sort of minimal idea of an omnipotent or origin. And even those who wouldn't call themselves theists might even adopt this result, just depending on how you fill out the rest of the picture. So you have kind of this minimal result of there's this instance of omnipotence. And that this instance of omnipotence does provide the kind of deepest possible explanation of our data. And that actually seems good. I mean, that part seems right to me. Maybe you can help me, if we want to talk a little bit more about this, to see what's really wrong with the priority monism. Because I'm thinking you can take on, my thought is that priority monism is just the view that the whole of reality is prior to the parts, and then we can leave open the nature of the whole of reality. And if physics is telling us the nature of the whole of reality transcends geometry, well, that's great. I mean, that's precisely what your argument would point to as well. That's not a problem for priority monism. That's in per se, it's just a problem for a particular additional theory about the world, that the whole is fundamentally geometric. But let's say that the whole is not fundamentally geometric. We could still have the instance of omnipotence being prior to its parts. Now, I know you don't like the idea that it would have parts because that adds complexity to the theory. But if you're talking about the laser, which is removing the parts from the most fundamental, it's like, how do I want to say this? The most fundamental description of fundamental reality won't be a description that specifies parts. It'll just be instance of omnipotence. And then from there, you maybe derive the emergence of parts that are posterior to it.
Yeah.
And I realize you have additional considerations that might narrow the bridge more, but I'm just now thinking that they're required for the core of your argument to get to a supreme being.
So
that's kind of my analysis.
My only thing is, I think if you become less specific on the matter, you're going to lose, number one, I think, predictive power. Because if let's say we took Schaffer's view, because I did say at the beginning, I do make this explicit in the paper, that priority monism is just a basic view that the whole is prior to its parts. Yeah. Then Schaffer adds another sort of fleshing out of it by identifying the whole as the space-time manifold. But I'm thinking that if you just take the general view, though, I don't think with that view you should have any reason to believe that there would be something.
I'm with you on that. This is good, Josh. It's priority monism itself doesn't predict the data in question. That's right. So an instance of omnipotence, some sort of original power that's supreme, that's going to predict the data in question in a better way than priority monism. But here's the point: priority monism doesn't compete with theism. And so, in other words, if you don't have competing hypotheses, then there's no reason to sort of remove the other hypothesis. So in other words, priority monism isn't the reason to believe that there's grounding. The grounding points to theism, but you don't also have to move priority monism off the table. You can say, if you're priority monist for additional reasons, other reasons that aren't about grounding, because my reading of the literature, it doesn't indicate to me that the reason people are priority monists is to explain all this data that you're seeking to explain.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. So I think someone like Schaffer he gave a list of arguments in his main
welcome
paper
him onto the bridge. You can invite him onto the bridge. You can get to
Yeah,
theism even with priority monism.
Yeah, exactly. No, and that's what I think, and maybe I should have been more clear, but that's what I was trying to sort of say with that last aspect of the
Okay.
argument, saying
Yeah.
you don't even have to do away with these ideas. You can have these ideas, but you just still have to descend or ascend higher to God to explain everything. You can't stop there. The explanatory stopping point is with God and not with these ideas as Schaffer and others have put forward. So that was my main thing. But also, I think... Yeah, sorry. Just quickly, what I was trying to do though in that paper is I was trying to steelman the opposition as much as possible in that saying, okay, you know what? Because if I went general and I just said go with priority monism, you're not even going to have any conversation about predictive power being met, or even background knowledge, because you're not really talking about anything specific. So how can it fit with other ideas? So I was trying to say, actually, if we take the best fleshed out theory on the table, does it compete with theism or not? But I'm even happy to say I don't think there are even these things if we take a more generalized view of the matter.
Yeah, and if it doesn't compete, I mean, maybe this is just merely about presentation, right? Like, if there's a theory that doesn't compete with this sort of destination of my argument, and I spend time sort of beating up on that theory, and then say, oh, but if you're willing to give off these parts, you can still come along. It's almost like maybe it's less inviting. It's almost like I want to first just make the simplest bridge to my conclusion, and then see, oh, my conclusion is compatible with this, so you guys can all come along as well.
Yeah. The only thing is, I would say, is that Schaffer himself is explicit in saying, not just priority monism, saying the whole is prior to its parts, but saying that it's fundamental. And so when we take though his idea, he's saying the universe is fundamental. So he makes it explicit. But I'm trying to say, no, we don't have good reason to take it to be fundamental. We can still have the priority monism framework at a general level, but the Schafferian view of it is problematic because he says the explanatory stopping point is with the universe and nothing beyond it. I'm trying to say,
so the question might be, what does the universe mean? And this is a difficult question, and it might vary. So from a certain theistic perspective, we're sort of accustomed to thinking of the universe as that which God creates. But it's fascinating because I've heard people define the universe as just the total of all reality, whatever it is. And I mentioned I was just having a wonderful conversation with Philip Goff on this, and the way that he describes the universe, he describes it as physical, but even that term physical is flexible enough for him to allow, on his own view, that the fundamental nature of reality is actually in terms of consciousness and not in terms of geometry. So it follows the latest physics in terms of geometry not being fundamental. And so even here, I mean, I'm not even sure, and I just don't know. I haven't talked with Jonathan enough to know if his concept of the universe is flexible enough so that if it turns out that the base level of the physical universe is an omnipotent, purely aware, conscious mind, if he would be okay with that on his own definition. And I don't know. And since I don't know, I'm actually happy to personally to even allow the idea that the universe just is the total of reality. And if the total is prior to its parts and it's a universal consciousness, then that's completely consistent with the destination of your argument.
No, that's helpful. Awesome, man. That's helpful.
Well, this is actually maybe a good time to end the conversation, or at least provide some like kind of overall thoughts, even though we've kind of just did that. But we're winding up. You've got a birthday party to get to, don't you?
I do. But I might need to run off in a bit. Well,
why don't we provide some overall general thoughts about the conversation? I mean, there's so many different ways. This is why this is so exciting to me, is because I just never thought about any of these connections before, partly because I'm not actively working in the field and I'm not familiar with all the people that you are. But it's just really cool to see new connections being made, and it's really awesome. So, anyways, let's provide some kind of closing commentary on the conversation so far. Let's start with Dr. Sijuwade, and then we'll close with Dr. Rasmussen.
Yeah, so yeah, I'm really grateful, Josh, for your. I think it was very helpful. You elucidated all of the needed areas and clarified it. So thank you so much for that, and thank you also for the needed pushback and clarifications on what we, with this argument, what do we need to really be committed to? I think that's very helpful for myself and for listeners and readers of the paper. But yeah, so my general just idea was trying to just say that I really believe that the fundamental structure of reality is God. And we have good reason to believe that because he's the simplest explanation that leads us to expect everything that's within that structure of reality, which we are committed to existing. And so there is good reason to, for us to not just stop at physics as a lot of philosophers do, but we have good reason to go to theology. And even in the paper itself, I was trying to just say at the end, maybe, as a domain of inquiry, theology should be there on the table as well and not just discarded, because just given general criteria that a lot of people would take to be true, and taking all of what's on the table at the moment, theism has great explanatory power, and it gives us such an ontologically parsimonious ontology that I think there's good reason to affirm, its truth and truth value, and at least for it to be on the table. And I think what's happened a lot of the time is it's not even there in the conversation, and that's why I'm really trying to push forward. But yeah, like I said, thank you so much, Josh, for the clarification. It was very helpful.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's just wonderful talking with you about this. And again, I mean, I feel like you have this skill of seeing treasures in other people's work and then putting them together in a new way so that the very people working on those particular treasures can sort of see a greater, possibly a greater treasure out of their own hands. And I think that's very cool to see that. I was also just kind of thinking about maybe non-theists in the audience and watching this, and I was thinking about how your kind of argument could even serve their project in terms of understanding the causal and explanatory structure of reality. I was thinking about Graham Oppy and his work on the foundation of reality, and I actually asked him if on his own view, because he thinks there is an initial item that has a kind of necessary existence, and that is a foundation of all other items. And I asked him if, on his own view, this item could be characterized as having as much power as possible, or maximal power, even if we call it a natural object, if it could still be sort of an instance of omnipotence. And in that email, he seemed open to that idea. It would still, he would still call it a natural object. And then there's maybe a further question about whether, what maximal power consistent with the natural world would imply. Would it imply, as Philip Goff would say, the powers of a mind, or not? But we could kind of maybe leave that open. And this is a way maybe to even invite more into, onto the exploration of your project, including those watching who maybe the word God would be sort of a scary word. It's like, well, that, we don't want to, well, maybe they would like to have a bridge to get to that conclusion, but it has a lot of other connotations. And there might be a way of sort of thinking of your project as leading to this sort of causal structure, explanatory structure of reality that could be very, very attractive and helpful for people coming from a wide range of viewpoints. So yeah, so I love what you're doing, and I'm glad to discover your work.
No, I really appreciate that. Thank you.
All right, I think that's going to do it for us today. I pushed the wrong button again. I'm just pushing all sorts of wrong buttons today. But yeah, I mean, like I said, I would just be repeating myself at this point. It was an awesome discussion. It was fun for me to actually just kind of sit back and let Josh, the other Josh, do the work of trying to interpret what's happening. It was just, and also I think that it was really good. I left you a whole lot of time to flesh out your responses and why you think the alternatives are bad, which is kind of like, we did that in the previous show as well, but I think that it was good to do it again. I mean, there's value in repetition at some level. But anyways, thank you guys for tuning in. It's been awesome. Thank you both for joining me, Josh Squared. Hey, someone actually said, can we do this real quick? Are you guys familiar with the Spider-Man meme where they're like pointing at each other? Have you seen that?
I think maybe. I think I know what you're talking about. So
what I want you guys to do is to like point at each other. Yeah.
This way?
Like, no, you got to point the other way. Yeah. But look at each, like, act like you're looking at them. No, other way. Other way. Yeah, there you go. Like you're looking. All Okay, we did it. All right. All right, I'll screen grab that and maybe put that as like the thumbnail. Who
Nice.
knows?
Yeah.
All right, that was a lot of fun. Okay. All right,
you.
thank you guys for joining me. And yeah, we'll try to do something again in the future. Maybe even just like break down one aspect of this argument in further detail. I don't know. But we'll talk more in email and stuff. And yeah, see you guys in the next Capturing Christianity video. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have hundreds, literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider